Okay, so I think on that point, I think we're good to go, guys. And first of all, just to, I suppose, to welcome everyone that is joining us and that and some will be watching this back on recordings as well. So T, also welcome. So look, it's fantastic to be back with the mini conference 2022. This is our third mini conference in the last 3 years, so it's fantastic to be back. And I suppose just first of all to say my own name is Paudie O'Reilly. I'm part of the Digital Transformation Lab working out of Cork University Business School, part of University College Cork. Look, it's definitely the highlight, and I know I've been saying it over the last few weeks when we're promoting this event. It's definitely the highlight of my year is this event. It's something that really is close to my own heart, but also something that the Digital Transformation Lab is a real advocate for, which is practitioner research. So very quickly, practitioner research is research really that's done not by full-time academics, but by people that work in industry. Okay, so the people that are presenting today are people really that are doing research within their own organizations, and it serves really three different purposes. One is it's there to create value for organizations by, I suppose, taking on challenges, and they could be problems, opportunities. Okay, so it's really about generating value. But secondly, it does that through leveraging rigorous knowledge, but also generating rigorous knowledge. So it's evidence-based. And the third point, really, it's about personal, professional development. So we say that really a good practitioner, researcher is also a better professional. They're evidence-based. And actually, I think that ties in really nicely with our keynote today, which will be delivered by Mr. Alan D. Duncan. And Alan will be talking about really the role of data literacy and data-driven culture for really digital business success. Okay, so I think it's really complementary to what we're talking about today. Look, we have a fantastic lineup of other speakers. We've here Mark Revel today, we've Kenneth Russell, we've Rory O'Callaghan, we've Sharon Jones, we've Gar McCreesta. It's going to be really quick fire. So I suppose each will present for maybe 10, 15 minutes, then it's Q&A. So again, we're really welcoming the audience today, but also inviting you to engage with it through chat, through the Q&A section. I'll definitely try and incorporate the questions that are coming through that or the points back into the discussions we have as we work through each paper. And I know we're then trying to give some extra time at the very end just to have a recap. And I know hopefully Alan will still be with us, and we'll be sort of also inviting Alan maybe to give us some sort of summary on what he's heard today. So again, please ask questions. Just to note, the session is recorded. And as I say, it's also being streamed elsewhere, I think on LinkedIn, YouTube, and I'll try and keep an eye on maybe questions coming through those sources as well. I'd also really like again to welcome the audience. I can see here even with people coming in from all different sort of regions of the globe already. We're based here in Cork, but we've people from around Ireland. I can see one or two names I recognize from the UK, Europe, and one I think even from the US. And I know the US, it must be a really early start for someone from the US. So on that point, I think I'm going to hand over really to our keynote, Mr. Alan D. Duncan, distinguished Vice President with Gartner. Alan, I know, is going to really fire our imaginations and maybe also provoke some new thinking in terms of digital transformation, etc. Alan, I'm inviting you to share your screen, and maybe you can say a few words about yourself.
Sure, Paudie. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I've probably had a long and checkered history with UCC and the business school and the IMI. Going back nearly 7 years now, I think we've been working together on various programs. In my role as the lead for Gartner's research around data-driven transformation culture, the human aspects of data and analytics programs, data literacy, what one colleague referred to as, oh, you're Alan Duncan, you do the fluffy stuff. But, you know, thinking about our success and dealing with the fact that it is very much a human problem, not solely a technical one. And certainly in a lot of my research and work, what we see is that the ability to engage, influence, storytell, guide people through change is actually a bit of a missing capability within many data and analytics practitioners. It's necessary to be technically excellent, but it's not sufficient. And in my work at Gartner and the research that we do in my area, complements all of the great work that my colleagues look at in terms of hype cycles and you know, magic quadrants and so on, which is very much focused on technology capability. We're looking then at how does that translate and parlay into how do we get people to work with us in a way that is actually meaningful and impactful. So I've got a few things to touch upon here today. We will be going through a bit of a whistle stop here, as Paddy says. I mean, the idea with the mini conferences that everything is fast paced, a lot to take in. I think what I want to give a sense of over the next 20 minutes is the degree of complexity and sophistication that is actually necessary in order to be successful with your data and analytics programs, and also some of the things that as leaders we want to be able to navigate in order to be able to achieve that success. So 3 themes here. Firstly, looking at how do we actually take advantage of our data and what does that mean? Where is the expression of value? Secondly, just a checkpoint on some of the capabilities that we need to put in place if we're going to realize that value, and then culminating in a discussion about the cultural and data literacy organizational capabilities, and translating the ambition and the execution into the things that we need to pay attention from a change point of view. So let's dive right in, and please do, as Paddy says, you know, let's put questions through that we can respond to. There, of course, will be question and answer after I've taken you through some of these ideas. But you know, please let's try and make this as interactive as possible. So, starting out with the crux of everything in many respects, which is, what do we mean by value from data and analytics? What does it mean to be data driven? Where is the value advantage that comes from the work that we do? This is not answering the questions, what do we deliver and how do we deliver it? It's answering the questions, why are we doing any of this and who are we doing it for? And ideally, we should also be able to get to how would we know if we are being successful? Measurable business outcomes. Now, clearly, a lot of the way that we articulate success is in economic terms, you know, financial drivers. Are we growing our revenues? Are we showing a profit? Are we managing our costs? If we're in a public sector environment, are we delivering value for taxpayer euros? There are other measures of success that we can also consider depending on who our stakeholders are. So I'm not purely looking at a monetary economic outlook on this, but certainly if you think in terms of follow the money, you know, what people are willing to spend on is a fairly good indicator of the things that they care about. So there's some things that we can do to understand, interpret, and influence the agenda that's being set, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and do that in a proactive way. And certainly what we see is that chief data officers, heads of business intelligence, etc., the ones that are perceived as being successful are the ones that have that very business-oriented view first and foremost. Yes, we have to do great data management delivery, data pipelines, data engineering. Yes, we have to do great data quality and data governance, etc. Those are necessary, but they are not sufficient. And actually, what we're finding in our research is if those things are where your emphasis lie in terms of the way you think about your agenda, actually, you're not going to be successful. So as leaders, we have to think in business outcome terms. We have to be able to engage and bring our stakeholders with us, understanding, like I say, why we're doing these things and what's the outcome we're trying to achieve and what's the measurable value that we are getting. If we can't position and articulate and communicate in those terms, we're setting ourselves up to struggle. Now, we recognize, of course, that is difficult. In fact, if you look at our latest Chief Data Officer research, then what we're finding is that the direct measurable results of good data management, good data and analytics, good data governance, you go down this list here and it gets to 29% before. Right, we look at the number 29% there on return on investment from data and analytics. Only under a third of respondents to our latest Chief Data Officer survey are actually able to demonstrate that the solutions and services and all of the work that their teams are doing are actually delivering measurable ROI. Under a third of all respondents, right? So there's an awful lot of scope here to engage with an agenda that says, we got to do better. All of the good delivery work, all of the measurement of output, how many reports did we create, how many dashboards did we deliver, did the data quality go up? Great that 57% of respondents are now saying we can show that we've met our expectations on improving data quality. Still only just over half, so there's an awful lot of folks out there working on data and analytics solutions and data governance and data management and so on, who still aren't able to even meet their basic delivery objectives around things like data quality and improving decision making. So even if you take the delivery measures, there's a hell of a lot of scope to do better. But in terms of parlaying that, like I say, into a measurable business outcome, it's still pretty indifferent in many, many respects. So that means we need to change the way we think and work and actually change the way we as leaders behave. And it means that first and foremost, our language and expression of what strategy needs to change. And I'm not only talking about data strategy here, I'm actually talking about business strategy. This is the link between the data strategy view and the business strategy view. In fact, you could go so far as to say there should be no difference between the business strategy and the data strategy. We want an overall business strategy that is infused with the articulation of data and analytics expectations. Because if we can get there, if we have really, really good understanding of what are we trying to achieve, what does success mean to us, and as leaders in that, we should be basically making sure we ask the question every single time, how will we know if we are being successful? You've told us what success might mean to us. We have more customers, we are making more profits, we've reduced our costs, we're serving our citizens better, healthcare, we have more patients treated and fewer return cases and lower mortalities. Whatever those things are, our duty of care in this strategic conversation is to make sure that our objectives are, well, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely. SMART goals. You've heard that, countless times. How often do we actually make sure that our organizations are running to that level of accountability, right? Now, that then means we also have to be guiding and steering our colleagues in the way that they think. We have to have the capability as an organization to operate that way. So there's a teaching involved, guidance and support to help our colleagues articulate themselves. Because almost certainly when we start this kind of conversation, the business colleagues don't necessarily think in specific, measurable, actionable outcomes either. They say, this is what I want to do. This is what I want you to deliver to me, right? It's in output terms or in task and activity terms. This is my function. This is my role. This is my job. None of those ways of articulating are about outcome. So tip here is to make sure that everything that we ever engage with, all of the business use cases, whichever line of service we come from, think in terms of not what output am I producing or what task am I doing. Think in terms of what questions are we asking. Then I can have the conversation that says, well, are we able to answer those questions? Do we have the data? Do we have the evidence? Then I can say, okay, as a result of getting the answers to the questions we're asking, what action am I going to take as a result? Our responsibility, our ability to engage with and influence strategic measurable outcome is this chain of thought. What am I asking? Can we answer it? What action we'll have? Right? Use case by use case, scenario by scenario, stakeholder group by stakeholder group. It also then gives us an anchoring for all of the good stuff around good data management practice, mapping my information supply chain, being able to communicate the data fabric, etc. Because by doing that ask, answer, act way of ensuring that things are articulated, then I've got a direct line of sight to the data we need and the outcomes that data serves. And I'm also in then a position to demonstrate clearly whether the data that we have or don't have is actually fit for the business purposes that we're trying to achieve. Yeah. So this is where all of the data cataloging, the enablement of data governance comes into play, because now by making the link between what data we've got, where it comes from, how do I get access to it, in the context of this is why we're trying to deal with that data, these are the business outcomes that it matters. And of course, looking at the cross-referencing and correlations from one function to another, I build critical mass, not just by saying use case by use case by use case individually, but actually by looking at how the data flows through the organization and mapping it. Then I can start to see where specific data sets are used in multiple use cases, and I can have the conversation about reconciling different conflicts of interest and so on. I could also say, well, this one use case requires multiple data sets. So I'm able to navigate and actually arbitrate, orchestrate the flow of information around the organization and make sure that it is well delivered in context. Good example of doing this is this very large manufacturing sector organization. We have redacted their real names to protect the guilty, but they were very, very happy for us to share their journey and story. They were struggling to get value from all of the investments they made in data and analytics. Large amount of effort and time in building out their data platforms, data lakes, data warehouses, self-service business intelligence. Either the business was getting value, great, except the data and analytics team were then not getting any kudos for the work. Yeah, you did nothing. It's all us as a business unit. Or if there was no progress being made, no value being shown, well, that's all the data and analytics team's fault. So they needed a change of conversation here. They needed to reframe how they were engaging with their stakeholders, and they did it in two ways. Firstly, they had the conversation every single time that says, what's the business outcome we're trying to target here? Where is the area of improvement we can make? Let's show up front, at least by modeling it, whether or not there is an opportunity. And if the line of business can't tell you why they want something, they don't have a requirement. Coming to me saying, this is the report or the dashboard or the model that I want you to build me, without the communication of why does it matter and how would I know if we're being successful, you don't have something that we're going to deliver. But there's more. The second thing they started to do was say, as a business stakeholder group, are you ready for the solutions we can deliver you? Do you work in an agile way? Are we applying DevOps as a co-creation way of identifying and delivering the solutions? Do you actually have the data and analytics and data literacy skills to interpret and understand and act upon the reporting and dashboarding that we could deliver you, et cetera, et cetera? So if you don't have the readiness for the solutions we're providing, guess what? You don't have a requirement, or at least you don't have a requirement for solution. There might be a requirement for training and coaching and education to help people be more data literate as a precursor, but we're not going to deliver you anything. You're not going to get your report or dashboard. Now, that ended up doing two things. Firstly, it focused the attention of where is the business going to get best effect from the contribution of the data and analytics team. Great. It also reduced the workload of the data and analytics team because they stopped doing non-value adding projects with stakeholders who weren't ready. So the workload went down, but the value productivity went up. Yeah, so we're doing less work and we're getting more value from it. That sounds like a result. Now, clearly, of course, there's a continuous and ongoing engagement to bring the folks who are not up to speed yet to a level where they could get value too, but that's just, smart building of my requirements backlog as well, right? So as a continuous and ongoing approach to program management and being able to then coordinate and orchestrate that to make sure that there's a sequencing and the dependencies are managed, front and center value, backed up by the conversation then, and we're going to go here in a second, about capability. So lots and lots of opportunity, and what we're seeing is that the leading chief data officers, the leading practitioners in our field, are now seeing the data and analytics center not just as a delivery center to support the current business model, but they're actually now looking at new opportunities to drive different sorts of business value from a monetization perspective. So that's not just deliver great excellence to the current business, it's how do we extend and enhance and potentially change the business through a digitalized and data-driven approach. Now, all of that requires a bunch of capabilities that we need to be clear and explicit about in terms of building the skills and competencies, the methodologies, the practices, and so on, the workforce to be able to achieve. These will be things that I would expect most of us to be planning for, and this is maybe just a reminder of some of those capabilities. So this may not necessarily be news, but I hope it is validation, and for one or two of us, it might be a little bit of provocation to say, oh, we haven't got that from a delivery point of view in our program. I'll need to take account of it. And the first is the ability of the organization to engage, just like that Sure Sparkle case. Do we have people who think and work and behave this way? If we don't, then our role as a data and analytics center of excellence is to encourage and foster that. Change management, transformational leadership, right? The human problem. Come back to that in a second. But if we don't have business engagement, business leadership, business education stream, we're probably missing a trick. And in many cases, that also means we actually probably need to do some training and coaching and development of the data and analytics function as well. Secondly, is my data governance and analytics governance fit for purpose? All too often, we take data and analytics governance as a controlling thing, lock it down, understand, you have to get permission to look at the data, rather than saying, how do we enable people to participate? And then how do we provide guide rails and support to ensure that any risks are mitigated and managed? That probably means we need a much more flexible approach to data governance, an adaptive approach, right? Maybe some of the other colleagues this morning will talk about this to some degree, but a control-based way of doing your data governance, know about everything, nobody gets permission unless they ask, is not the way we're going to proceed here. Thirdly, from a technical point of view, we have to be providing a portfolio approach. It is not a case of going to one vendor and saying, give me your BI tool and we're all done. Data lakes and data warehouses work in conjunction. They are not mutually exclusive. The idea of a data fabric as a way of understanding and communicating the entirety of the data that's in our ecosystem and how the data flows work, and some of that will be physically delivered and some of it will be more virtually handled, all managed through a metadata driven approach. More and more data, more and more sources of information, more difficult combinations and correlations. The technology is definitely a catalyst, but it's not a panacea. Fourthly, the ability to share data internally and with other external parties becomes absolutely critical to business success. If you are saying we are going through a digital transformation, then you have to understand what that means in terms of the relationships that are inferred or implied from the data that we have, the data that we need. We cannot think of this only anymore in terms of customer and supplier. We have to be working in terms of the flow around the business ecosystem, right? So some very quick things there to think about in terms of what am I doing in terms of delivery and execution from a people, process, and technology perspective, really. Right? And we have to make sure that all of those output delivery things are tied to outcome. Finally, I want to come back to the cultural piece, the behavioral aspect, that it has to be our duty of care, the thing that we are most passionate about, to make sure that people in our organization and potentially outside of our organization think and work and behave in a data-driven manner. And our research is showing that the organizations that achieve being data-driven, by whatever definitions you choose, but they all have certain characteristics about how they're set up, how the culture operates, how the way people think before they act. And that's not pervasive. Clearly, there are big challenges, and our Chief Data Officer survey, for perennially almost, has been showing that human factors in various balance are still the overarching set of factors that influence whether we will succeed or not. So we have to, as data leaders, be very clear in setting our attention on ensuring that we guide people through all of that and engage with it in a way that is meaningful and relatable. Right? The psychology of change becomes absolutely critical. We have to be influencers. We have to be business leaders. We have to guide folks through what we're working with them on. And indeed, we're looking at a trajectory that says the vast majority of organizations will have conscious, deliberate programs intended to create different knowledge, different skills, different understanding, different behavior in their people. Yeah. If you don't do that, you will fail. It's that stark. So please make sure that you think about, plan for, learn about the engagement in data literacy, data culture, transformational thinking and planning. Right? Treat everything you do as a human problem first, which then has technology implications, perhaps. So a whistle-stop tour, certainly. We could go into all of those areas and more in much, much more detail. And of course, as Poddy knows, when we're working on some of the programs, we do go into much, much more detail in those areas. But the story around what does it mean to be a data-driven organization? What do we have to put in place to achieve that? The strategic view, why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? How would we know if we're succeeding? The operating model view, what do we put in place? How are we going to deliver it? Who's going to do the work? All underpinned by the development of capability in our people to think and work and behave in this data-driven, evidence-based way, as the way we do things. With that, I'll ask Poddy, what have we got in terms of questions or?
Yeah, that's fantastic, Alan. So we've about 5 minutes, maybe shy of it. So again, if anyone here on the panel wants to ask a question, I'm just keeping an eye on the different channels here. I suppose one thing, Alan, I suppose we're hearing or seeing is that really we're now in a world, that's far more complex, quicker changing, and this need for emergent thinking. And in a way, sort of the way sometimes we teach or the way we think of data, it's very structured and very structured mechanisms, methods, etc. How do we reconcile those two worlds, an emergent world out there, and yet very often when we think of data, we think in very structured ways? So
I think thinking in structured way is good, Poddy, right? We need to have discipline. There has to be an orchestration. But I think it was General Patton. Forgive me if I'm kind of paraphrasing a bit or misattributing, but no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? But you don't go into battle without a plan. The strategy and operating model framework gives us a way of anchoring everything that we do and being able to say, how do things fit together, right? If we're then able to say, okay, there's emergent characteristics, new things are happening in our market that we hadn't planned for. We've just seen, the last 2 years lessons in having to adapt quickly, right? And I guess we're going through another cycle at the moment that is creating that through other world macroeconomic and geopolitical forces, right? But having a framing of how are we approaching things? What are the things that we are paying attention to? How do they fit together? Then allows us to be more adaptable to say, if circumstances have changed, what does that do to what we're currently doing? And how do we then respond quickly to accommodate as best we can those changes to our thinking and planning, right? Structured approach, methodology, and practice doesn't slow us down. It speeds us up. As long as we have clarity about what we're doing and how we're approaching it, and then the willingness to adapt when circumstances change.
Yeah, very cool. And I can see here a fairly what I call profound comment that the success of people with data in their title depends on people that don't have data in their title, and that soft, that you call it, I think, the fuzzy stuff or the fluffy stuff up front. But do we have people really that have data in their title that have those skills, even the empathy for people within the business, external stakeholders?
Sorry to say, not enough. And actually, I mean, let me. I'll take you back to the data on this to say, that many of our chief data officer survey respondents are saying we don't have people with the right skills, the right knowledge, the right behaviors, and we don't have enough of them. But what that means is that we've got to be recognizing that and dealing with it. Now, that might be that we as leaders actually need to develop our own skills and knowledge. I mean, obviously that's what we do on the data business program. It's what we do on the digital healthcare program. The business information systems programs are all around equipping leaders to be able to engage with people in a different way and help understand the disciplines and practices that are required. It's hard, it's difficult, right? But it's also necessary. And if that means we take a step back from our own point of view and say, okay, we're delivering a whole bunch of stuff and things, but who are we delivering it to? Are they ready for it? Then we might come to, are we ready for it? And here's another thing, by the way, just as an observation, people with data in their title, a lot of them don't actually understand the data, right? They understand the technology. They can build you an ETL job. They can show you how a data pipeline is engineered and put together. They can build you a report or dashboard. Don't ask them to interpret the results and convey that into what are the impacts on the business that we're learning. It's astonishing how many data and analytics practitioners don't understand the data.
That's it, yeah. And we're talking a lot at the moment, Alan, on our side here, let's say within Cork University Business School, about trying to bring that data mindset, digital mindset, and design mindset together, and trying to maybe bring those literacies together. Good. Alan, I know you're going to hopefully stay with us during the morning, and I know we're going to be revisiting this, but we're now going to get into the messiness of organizations and what's happening in organizations. So I think Brilliant. You've given us a very appropriate sort of foundation maybe to think about some of our next presenters. So as we said earlier, it's really quick fire here, guys. You're going to have to keep up with us. I hope you've drank your coffee this morning. It's high energy stuff. And I think we're handing over to Mr. Mark Greville. Now, Mark, VP for Architecture and Work Human. Mark.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Thank you, Alan. Fantastic. And it's amazing talking about data, and very, very important. But as the comedian Stuart Lee once said, you can prove anything with facts. And one of the things I want to talk about a little bit is about how you use, how you think about things, how you use data, what data you should use, and maybe how you figure out what the technical health of a business is. So this is the conduit metaphor. And the conduit metaphor describes how we understand something. So this was invented in an essay by Michael Reddy in 1979. And he talked about people speaking or writing as if they insert their mental contents. So their feelings, meanings, concepts, thoughts, they insert them into containers, which are kind of words or phrases or sentences. And then their contents are extracted by listeners and readers. And often what you have in your head as you communicate to somebody and what somebody else gets in their head is very, very different. And you can tell the age of this cartoon by the Thelma and Louise and Terminator references, but often, and I'm sure my wife would recognize this in many contexts. But it can be very difficult for somebody, an individual, to convey their thoughts, to convey exactly what they mean to somebody else, and that's the point here. So what's our conduit metaphor for how well technology is doing in an organization? Well, I suppose how well something is doing is kind of measured by usually some metrics. So Alan spoke very eloquently and very, very well, very enjoyably about data and how we pull and govern data together. But if it's difficult for an individual to communicate something to an individual, well, then it becomes way more difficult for an organization or a group in an organization to communicate a complex socio-technical field to somebody. So we have to reduce it to metrics or models or frameworks. And, you know, in technology, there's a tyranny of choice of frameworks and models and all types of things. I've just listed a few of them. Alan, I've stuck in the EIM in there, which is a good framework, I think. But there's lots. I mean, you know, you could pick any of 200 probably. And to be honest, in a day-to-day technology department, few of these are mentioned. And I say that I worked in a bunch of mid-sized companies. I worked in British Telecom. I worked in Bank of America for 12 and a half years. And I'm a VP in WorkHuman, which is, you know, it's a unicorn, one of the most successful technology companies ever, native companies in Ireland. So, you know, I do see and hear and I live and breathe this stuff. Few of these things are really mentioned day to day. One of the things that is mentioned, it's mentioned in our workplace. It's mentioned at a lot of tech conferences, you know, like QCon conferences or O'Reilly. You'll see it on Hacker News or on various blogs. It comes from the book Accelerate, and they talk about, for building technology, they talk about 4 measures. They talk about deployment frequency. So how quick something goes, you know, the frequency at which new releases go in, a lead time for changes. So they change from the commit to when it appears into production. Mean time to restore. So if there's an issue, the time it takes to resolve that in production, and a change failure rate, the ratio of deployments that lead to errors and successful deployments. So these are kind of more the language of people who build technology. And this is where I kind of live day to day. And that's not to say that these are the best measures, but they're common. And we shouldn't mistake common for good. but these are certainly very common. And so no real agreement, I think, on how to measure technology health right now. So what can we learn from a business? Businesses spend a lot of time looking at data and looking at metrics to see how they're doing. And there's a whole bunch of stuff, again, you know, share price and total debt, EBITDA and cash flows and all types of things. But the truth of it is that individual metrics don't tell the full story of how you measure a business. And in fact, businesses often, there's kind of 4 key ratios that businesses tend to use to see the health. So, you know, liquidity first, so quick ratio, that's liquid assets measured against current liabilities, so liabilities due in 1 year. And that tells you how a firm can write out kind of short-term obligations. So if the firm's going to go bust right now because there's no money left, basically. Solvency, then debt to equity ratio, and that's total liabilities, you know, divided by total shareholder equity. And that kind of tells you in the long term, will the company go out of business? You know, does the company have enough to keep going? And then, you know, how efficient is a company? It's operating margin, which is revenue minus the cost of goods sold, minus kind of admin stuff, divided by revenue. And that tells you, you know, how well a company can kind of turn inputs into cash. And profitability is similar, but a little tighter. Again, it's net. So you also take away interest and taxes and other expenses, other operating expenses as well. And these are kind of 4 key ratios that businesses use. And these have been around for quite a while. But of course, it's important as well not to put too much into these too, because you can't compare every single company with every other company using these ratios. It's generally within particular industries. But it's certainly a much more common practice to use these type of things to measure the health of a business. So you can see business and technology in terms of how you measure their health are disconnected. So it feels like there's a lot of room for technology to grow here. Now, so then we just look back at the business again, and we see that we have lag indicators and lead indicators. And if you watch ads often enough, as unfortunately I do now and again, and you see financial products, they'll often say, past performance is no guarantee of future performance. And I think one of the reasons for that is that financial metrics are lag indicators. So lag indicators look at the past to see how the business is doing. And then lead indicators are factors which might predict future performance. So how do we add lead indicators into the mix? Well, one of the kind of major developments in this area was introduced in 1992 by Kaplan and Norton. It's a HBR paper And there, it's the front page of it there. The balance scorecard measures that drive performance. So the clue is in the title. And what they did was they, and many other researchers, in fact, did some work with a gentleman called Arthur Schneiderman from a company, Analog Devices. And Schneiderman developed what he called a corporate scorecard in somewhere around 1986, where, again, he tried to predict, he tried to mix a number of measures to give a good rounded view of his business. And it was successful in his case. And this paper became a success as well. And basically, the balance scorecard, this paper answers 4 questions. So it asks, how does the customer see business? That's the customer's perspective. What must we excel at? The internal perspective. So what processes and efficiencies must be generated? How can we continue to improve and create value? So how innovative is the company and how well the company learns? And how do we look to shareholders? So the financial perspective. So the financial perspective is only one of 4 perspectives here. Now, of course, as with any academic work, there's a number of issues with the balance scorecard paper. No references. I was very disappointed at when I read it first. No empirical data either. No justification for how you come about with those 4 perspectives. And they focus mainly on how to implement a scorecard, not how to choose the measures. And I see I spelled choose with a single O. But there's now 3 generations of the business scorecard. So it has evolved and it's become a very common tool. And in fact, when I was at Bank of America, it was often mentioned KPIs would roll up to a balanced scorecard and people use that balanced scorecard to manage. And it is, for example, widely used in banking. So we've seen that we talked about lag and lead indicators. And we talked about how you measure technology health and how you measure business health. So I'm proud to say that Paddy and I and Stephen McCarthy, who I think might be in the audience somewhere, had a paper published in January at the Hicks conference on technical debt. And one of the things that we were asking is technical debt useful? Is that useful somehow as a perspective to measure how, what the health of a technology company is, what the health of technology within a company is? And we found 2 things, actually. We found, first of all, that there's no common language. So technologists often make technical decisions, which are in fact business decisions, and sometimes are actually major strategic business decisions. And the business don't understand what the technologists are doing, and the technologists don't have a language to explain it to the business. Alan mentioned earlier about how proficient data professionals can be about building pipelines and building dashboards or whatever, but if you ask them to explain what any of it means, you often fail. And but this is similar across a lot of technical decisions that we found. So you often end up with the following scenario, right? Where the business, the business think they're getting something, technology think they're building something else, and you end up with the like Henrik Neisberg's great cartoon here, a half a bridge and half of a tunnel, right? So there's a big disconnect here. So one of the things that we developed as part of our paper was Topology. And this leans on the business scorecard idea. And it talks about the impact of technical debt, and it splits it into customer impact, financial growth, strategic, and internal business. So we reviewed over 100 papers, and we found that technical debt has a positive and negative effect. So technical debt can indicate it can improve sometimes market opportunities or customer satisfaction, but too much technical debt can impede that. It can lead to technical bankruptcy, and there's a lot of great examples, one of which Netscape Communicator, when Netscape Navigator was a big thing, basically technical debt on that basically bust that company. There's examples with RIM as well when Apple came along. The ability to innovate can be accelerated or impeded. It can have big strategic security. I think, we see a lot in the press these days about security issues, that some of which can be traced back to technical debt. And then also, things like staff turnover. We're in the great resignation or the great job swapping or whatever it's called right now. And technical debt can certainly have an impact in both a negative and positive way. If a company is very strict about paying every single thing down, it can slow everything down. That can be frustrating. If a company allows a laissez-faire approach to it, it can be very frustrating for developers working there as well. So that was the first version of the topology that we came up with. But then we came up with a different view as well, which is the outside-in perspective. And this is certainly very different, and it leans on the triple bottom line, which was Elkington's work. And Elkington talks about how instead of a company looking from the outside, looking from the inside the company out, companies should look at economic, social, and environmental impacts and look at the outside and basically look in. And so we looked in our paper at environmental factors. So we found that Bitcoin in one paper used more electricity to mine Bitcoin than the whole country of Iceland. We looked at a whole bunch, and there's lots and lots of social impacts between social media causing discontent and disruption. There's a good reference to a paper which talks about incarceration in the US and how it disproportionately affects people of different races. And there's obviously broader economic impacts as well. And sometimes there can be contagion in an environment when something happens. So there's a number of examples in there as well. Certainly worth reading the paper, I think, is the key here. Now, funny enough, a friend of mine who, when he looked at this and I showed him some of this, he said that this was kind of, this outside in perspective, he said it was crazy, kind of like a 60s liberal conspiracy kind of a thing. And he said, look, you think, the hard-nosed capitalists would never, ever go for something like this, right? And I said, actually, that the fact that he split everything into kind of left-wing and right-wing perspectives probably tells more about him than it does about the subject he was talking about. But look at this. The SEC this month just proposed a new rule about climate-related disclosures for investors. So not only was my friend wrong, and I hope he brought some salt and pepper, John, to eat your lunch with, but the SEC is beginning to regulate the climate impact, so to measure somehow that environmental impact. And I don't think it's long before we're going to see similar for social impact as well. So it's not all a liberal conspiracy theory after all. But I suppose, so this was the initial paper, right? Was to try and build a topology, to try and start to understand if technical debt somehow could give us a lens, could give us a perspective on the health of a company. And we found that technical debt, rather than being a very narrow thing which technologists own, actually has major business impacts across a whole variety of strategic factors. And in fact, even environmental, social, and general economic impacts as well. So our next step really is to try and measure some of this empirically and maybe create a scorecard to facilitate understanding. And it's going to probably require a lot of qualitative research, but that should be quite exciting. But, the goal here really is to create a better conduit between business and technology, and to allow us to have those vehicles to convey those thoughts and to convey what we're trying to do from technology to the business and vice versa. So that's it. That's me. I have a link to the paper on my blog as well, if anyone wants to, and I'll post these slides on there probably later in the week too.
Yeah, well done, Mark. And again, I'm just keeping an eye on the various channels here. So I suppose one thing, Mark, probably the technical debt has been introduced to maybe create sort of that conduit for technologists to maybe put things in the language that maybe particularly financial people can understand, and vice versa. So in terms of I suppose what you're doing here, would it be true to say that you're proposing to extend the metaphor of technical debt so it can look at that inner and outer perspective, and that it can result really in being a tool that can be used by others to understand each other really, and the impact of decisions, technical decisions, particularly on the business?
100%, Buddy. Yeah, 100%. And that's I think the really important point here, which I probably didn't make clear. It's so for a business person talking to a technologist, and this has happened every job I've ever had, it's very difficult for them to understand what decisions are being made by technologists, because that shared language, as I mentioned, is not there. So when they sometimes ask for something, they put it into the conduit, give it to the technologist. The technologist interprets it in a certain way. But often, and this is the insidious thing, often a technologist might make what seems to them a relatively minor decision, but in fact, it might be a one-way decision. So once you make that decision, it's a path-dependent decision. You can't come back from it. And all of a sudden, that shuts out a whole raft of business opportunities that the business maybe possibly wanted to take advantage of. And the technologist also has no way of not only explaining it, they don't understand that there is any business impact whatsoever. So what we would like to do, I think, is exactly that, to extend the metaphor, to create a better shared understanding so that there's something in common that they could use, and to give a little bit more detail and understanding across between the business and technology.
And how do you see it being used in the field, in reality, Mark? Is it someone will come in and they will have been trained, in maybe this extended concept of technical debt, or is it that they're going to come in maybe with a tool that will sort of be useful in driving deeper and wider conversations? So, like, what are you going to give people in organizations that can help them here?
I think, Polly, it's going to be an artifact, and the artifact should be to facilitate that deeper discussion, a conversation between the two. So that's basically it. There's a little bit of work to do, and there's a lot of work to do in terms of the artifact design. But absolutely, yeah, sometimes a shared artifact that facilitates a conversation.
Yeah, and I think very, very powerful. So I think we'll move on again. I think this will come up in conversation, but I can really see how it sort of overlaps with some of the stuff that Alan was talking about, trying to create these bridges between, the technical and the business. So I think very, very sort of synergetic with some of the stuff Alan was talking about. So I'm sure it's going to come up again. And on that note, we're switching on again. And I can see actually one or two comments there. I think Gar is talking about, now I assume again, the value of these extended ways of looking at technical solutions, and I think Gar is saying that actually the paper, Mark, is very useful in stretching the way we think about things. And you're right, the triple bottom line, was it in 94? John Elkington started talking about it, but I see now even if I get the name, I think Larry Fink of BlackRock saying, guys, if you don't have a net zero ready business model, you're not ready for investment. That's a major, major change in the way we're looking at, because again, that narrative is becoming mainstream now, so I think it also plays in with that narrative, Mark. So well done, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can see Ken was stretching, getting ready, limbering up there earlier. So Ken, over to you next.
Thanks, Paddy. Well done, Mark. That was an amazing insight, and I love the way you used pastel there as some part of the framework. So yeah, fascinating stuff. So today, guys, hopefully you can see my slides. Paddy?
Yeah, we can see them now,
Yeah.
Ken. Yeah.
Grand. So today, I'm just going to go through some work we've been doing regarding the concept of cognition as digital transformation middleware. I've worked for the last 30 years in digital transformation. So I'm hoping to just show how, as Alan succinctly said during his presentation, the adaptive approach to data governance is so critical to how we actually transform businesses through digital technology. And it's never about the technology, as many papers have alluded to. So hopefully you can bear with me, and I'd love it if you had any questions to post them to Paddy. Thanks. So day to day, you're walking through your job. It's usual stuff. Someone mentions a digital transformation is coming through in the company, and it's a jungle. There's light, noise. The shade is presents threats, and let's say the bits of light or chinks of light in the jungle present opportunity. And then suddenly you see this sign, and I think this is a sort of symptomatic sign of exactly what's happening in most of our companies with digital transformation. You get this mad behavior where people pull, let's say, the data that they have into the tree and up at the top of the tree or wherever, and they literally hold on to that data, and we don't get any movement in the different aspects of the business that need to move forward. So in IS, we've traditionally seen where the papers concentrate on two particular aspects, and that's process and platform. And in the digital transformation, I love that Alan mentioned data-driven culture, because most people mention data, but I think it's actually more to do with the people. It's actually the data-driven culture we should be looking at. And we know that the people are, say, we're the leopards, we're the ones that are hoarding this data for various reasons. And this behavior is something I'm going to try and explore today. The behavior is driven by, let's say, a bit of the hard wiring, our propensity to not want to change. So I think in 1949, neuropsychologist Donald Hebb, he said that the neurons that fire together wire together. So to change that behavior is so difficult. And we as practitioners, to try and get the organization to change for a digital transformation, we have to try and challenge those hardwired neurons that people have. So what is digital transformation? Why do we care about it? The Driscoll model of reflection tells us that 70% of digital transformation fails. And the focus, as I mentioned, is in process, platform, and people. But information systems, they look at traditionally sometimes emotion and sometimes behavior. So we've had great papers from Beaudry and Pinsonow, for example, that look at the emotional aspects of it. Many papers studying the behavioral aspects. So for example, user acceptance testing and that whole genre about 10 or 15 years ago. But today I'm going to propose that beliefs are important as they drive this behavior. So this is based on the work of psychologists like Albert Ellis, Judith Beck, and her father, Aaron Beck, who just passed away there. And also, Carol Dweck as well. And the so what is and now what is that maybe it's a possibility that cognition could become the middleware, that's the connective tissue between the application's data and users. And I saw a post recently, I think it was by a guy called Brian Hennessy, about the Irish being sort of cultural middleware, in that whenever you go somewhere and it's difficult, they act as a kind of a liaison between two parties that are diametrically opposed in some situation. So I'm going to look at this aspect of, could IS use cognition? And if we did have a use case, what would the leopard say? So just to give you a summary, cognitive process, where we have a DT situation proposed, cognitive process is the beliefs and thoughts of someone regarding that DT situation being posed to them. And the output is some type of emotional reaction and behavioral outcomes. And the background to the use case is the number one CIT provider in the Balkans. They were just about ahead in 2016 as the number one provider. They were a sub company to the parent company in Germany. And 2016, they'd just gone through the most onerous financial, let's say, situation that anyone in Europe had seen. the methodology used, they wanted to try and maintain the #1 position, and they wanted to bring in a new a customer experience platform. So we went through the notes taken by consultants across 38 particular interviews. Some of them had 2 or 3 people in the interviews, and some of them had singular people in them, and use open axial codification in that. And the target groups in the interview set were retail assistants from shops, customer services representatives who take the phone calls from obviously customers with problems, field engineering, really interesting stuff there, network management people, operational aspects, the engineering guys who plan and maintain the overall architecture, that something like Mark would have been doing, and also interestingly the customer loyalty and marketing people, as well as the management. And the question we pose is to investigate what the individual's cognitive predisposition, as in what is their perception of the proposed digital transformation and their thoughts and beliefs towards that impending digital transformation. We used a model I proposed with Paddy and John McAvoy in a paper to the Journal of Decision Support there last year. And using a subset of that, we're going to concentrate on just the thoughts and beliefs. Now, Beck has alluded to the fact that the beliefs actually are higher order of cognition than thoughts, in that they help to form the thoughts. So beliefs are really where this digital transformation process, I believe, is at. And I hope that that can be the key to the adaptive approach to data governance that Alan mentions. And so if we look at the thoughts, the definition in Beck's terms are actual words or images that go through a person's mind, and the beliefs, which are the global, rigid, and overgeneralized aspects that someone might believe about a digital transformation. That's where we went with this case study. When we looked at the top level of what beliefs people proposed in answering a question during the consultant's review of these 38 people, they said that there was, in answer to the question, I believe the most difficult aspect of the impending DT is, they would have mentioned stuff like lack of collaboration. So we, a few different aspects of that covered, mostly individual responses to, lacks of tools and, process stuff, etc. The type of typical stuff you would see. However, if you dig deeper into it and a second level of their beliefs, I'm sorry this is a bit busy, but so I'll give you an example. The guy that's the sponsor of the program for CXM, he was really heavily invested in this, but he could see the opportunity to merge the, say, fixed and mobile entities and through jobs mentality and a data culture, and then also push back people like network planning who seem to know it all, etc. So it's been used as a weapon, let's say. The field engineering manager, interestingly, this is where the value of the digital transformation comes through. These guys were heavily invested in the status quo before the data-driven culture of the new CXM system was proposed. But now they're not so personally involved because of the types of financial restrictions that the company had on budget, etc. They had outsourced many of the field engineers, and as a result, the team these guys were managing had reduced in size, and their value in the company had diminished. So they were now competing with third-party contract field engineers who were outperforming them in terms of the compliance with the data-driven culture. And their field engineers, while they were semi-invested in the status quo before the digital transformation was proposed and the new metrics required, they were now fully disengaged from the data-driven culture proposed because their prior identity, and I know Steve McCarthy and Paddy had previously put a paper out about identity in information systems change and the importance of that. But their identity as prior to this, they were heroes in the community where they would go to sites and fix someone's cable problems, etc. They're now getting that threatened by these new third-party engineers who are exposing them and outperforming them. Now, the interesting thing is they were doing things like that leopard I mentioned earlier. They were holding back the data that they had on their handheld tablets. And the reason they were holding back the data was because the more data they presumed they put into the system, the less that they got out of it. and they were being exposed. They weren't labeling cables, and this sounds all very trivial, guys, but at the end of the day, when the cables weren't labeled, when it comes to mean time to repair, as Mark said there earlier, as a metric, other engineers would come in and couldn't find that the cable was labeled. Simple stuff, and it comes down to nomenclature and ultimately to a data-driven culture. They don't either want to, or they don't understand why they need to label the cables, and obviously then impact on having an MTTR, mean time to repair, that's actually sufficient for the company to resume operations and maintain their _1 position in the market as far as customers are concerned. Other people that were of interest, marketing analysts, yeah, they don't want to have anything to do with this new data-driven culture, because they just want to roll out new products and maintain their lovely cozy position with the VIPs or corporate and governmental customers. Many others were analyzed as well, and we got different varieties of beliefs expressed. So all of these beliefs, you can see some of them there, they're based in different perspectives from their view of what others should be doing in the company. And ultimately, there's a loss of cohesion, it seems, in terms of the data-driven culture. And I think, as Alan said, we need to guide people in a way that's more meaningful. So there needs to be some type of alignment of expectations in what this data-driven culture means, and alignment of the value of the digital transformation to these people in particular. That needs to be explained to them. So what does all this mean? Ultimately, if you put the findings into a conceptual typology through cognitive belief system with the selected predispositions, you'll find that the CXM manager and the ones that are highly invested in this, and the cloud services engineer and the third-party field engineers who want to progress in the company, so they want to get away from the third-party company and join the incumbent company. And usually these are young guys who want to move into the incumbent because they see it as secure. And that's because they've come out of college during this financial crisis in 2008. And they now see that the best opportunity for their career security is with the company. So they accept, believe in the value of the proposed digital transformation culture to them personally. And they also comply with the stipulations of the driven culture, the data-driven culture, as in they label the cables, etc. So they will facilitate all the requirements of that data-driven culture. On the opposite end, the retail sales advisors who are driven by commission, they don't want any extra forms to fill out. They're just driven by whoever walks into the shop. They want to sell more handsets or more data plans and get the dollar commission on that. And you can see then that the field engineering managers, they're not quite sure. They accept, they reject the beliefs of the data-driven value culture to them, but they accept that they need to comply because they can see where if they can audit, if they can get a new identity and a new role in auditing the third-party field engineers, they have a new identity being proposed for them. So therefore, they will comply while they're not quite in belief yet. So I think that's a useful model I'm working on at the moment with the guys. And it just shows that there's 3 levels of cognitive belief predisposition prior to a proposed digital transformation. So while you've the level 3 individual cognitive beliefs, these feed into these types of archetype, meaning they're either appetizers, and I'm using a Boolean table to try and just point out what these appetizers are like. They don't really believe in it and they don't really comply with it, so they're apathetic and they remove dynamism and energy in the digital transformation. There's also agnostic compliers, so something like the field engineering managers. They're doubtful or non-committal, but they will actually comply with the preface. Believer sinners are guys that support a cause or belief, but yet live another one. And lastly, the ones that I think George Westerman said in his digital transformation leading change book, we need these digital champions, crusader acceptors, the guys that were the, let's say, expats that returned from Germany and the parent company, and they know where the culture, data-driven culture brings and the benefits it brings to the organization. And they're the ones that are driving this digital transformation. And ultimately, those beliefs all impact on the digital transformation. So summary, Dweck says the challenge is an adaptive approach to digital transformation culture to address those fixed mindset beliefs and adapt a growth mindset. I hope that the DT middleware glue can be helping co-creation of the digital transformation roadmap, as Westerman calls for. We can anchor then the change management communications. As you know, the original communications from the executive team are absolutely crucial, with a clear message of what's in it for me, what's the value for me, like Alan mentioned earlier on. And I think the schools of psychology and medicine show that IS now is an opportunity to use cognition in addressing complex DT. And I think Elaine is on the call. She's mad into the Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who suggest that we challenge these assumptions built on our thoughts and beliefs. There's a few limitations to the paper or the current research, obviously, lack of longitudinal data. I'm trying to get back in contact with the company that originally gave the information to my teams of consultants out there. And ultimately, yeah, we need more research. Ultimately, we don't stop learning. I hope there's some questions, and otherwise, thanks for listening today, and sincere thanks to Paddy and the faculty.
Yeah, well done, Ken. And there's definitely a lot of response to it, and a lot of it sort of saying thumbs up, you know, in terms of the model, that we do need to understand beliefs, you know. So a question, and just maybe, I suppose, bringing together some of the comments I can see, Ken. So let's say with these field engineers, and it could be seen as a threat to their identity. Now, digital transformation can be a threat, you know. So what could the organization have done differently? I know you say it should explain the impact on them, you know, but if the impact is going to be negative to some extent, how do you bring and how do you deal with this?
Yeah, I think Alan mentioned it earlier on, to guide people in a way that's meaningful, and that's the key to this, I think, you know, to actually tell people what's the value in this digital transformation for them individually, and that's absolutely key. But our organizations, you see there, like 70% are failing, and I have some figures here what that means in reality. You know, there's anything up to $7.8 trillion per annum by 2024 is predicted by Statista to be the actual cost of digital transformation, sorry, the value of digital transformation. And if 70% is failing, that's a massive cost being lost. So how do we get that cost? How do we engage people? And I think it's because we need to look at what their needs are. We need to get them to converse and explain. And Westerman mentions in the leading digital book, encouraging open conversations and crowdsourcing your employees to co-create solutions. That's where we can help engage people in a meaningful way, as Alan said. And I think that co-creation, it's something that Steve and yourself have written about extensively, Paddy. This co-creation aspect is absolutely crucial. So unless we show at the very start that we're being human and empathetic and understand people and emotionally engage them in the digital transformation, which means a digital-driven culture or data-driven culture, we can't really get them on board.
And so, like, Ken, in a way, what we're saying here is look, the field engineers that are employed by the company directly were underperforming when you compare maybe some of their performance metrics compared to the contract service providers. So that has to be clear. But what maybe I'm hearing you say is the company didn't give them an opportunity for designing an alternative to addressing those issues, but instead it was perceived by the field engineers as, look, in a way, it isn't in our interest to actually even label cables because it's helping the contract service providers to perform even better, but also we're not going to feed the data that's required into systems because it makes it even more apparent then that we're underperforming. Is that a fair enough summary?
That's an absolutely spot on summary, Paddy. So just like the leopard holding the deer in the tree, These guys are holding the data back purposely, and it means that there's no movement, because ultimately is at the lowest point of granulation in the network, where they don't have cables labeled and they don't conduct, for example, audits properly on the fan filters, and yet they're saying on their handheld devices that they did change the fan filters, and they've a lot of problems with, I know this sounds ridiculous, guys, that there's dust and wind and environmental problems and heat, obviously, over in the Balkans. These are the problems that are the reality on the ground, and creating the mess that's on the ground daily. And if these guys aren't changing the fan filters, aren't labeling the cables, and aren't especially putting in the data on their handheld devices so that they can reduce the mean time to repair, they will become second in the market. The regulator will judge them as so, and therefore they will lose confidence from the stakeholders, like the shareholders. Their market value and reputation will go down. So there's massive impacts from the smallest little job that these guys should be completing. But because they're not engaged, because they see their numbers being reduced, they're outsourcing their jobs and their colleagues are leaving, etc., and their identity in the community is gone, because as they walk through the village, they're no longer George, the field engineer who fixes my IPTV. They're actually just, oh, that's the guy that was the incumbent field engineer in this area. And we now have a new guy in a lovely flashy van, and they fix it quicker and they do it in a much better way and a better job. So yeah, it's human.
But in a way, then, though, can we really blame the organization on one hand, because the contract service providers are more efficient, more effective? They've probably more of a lean over them. So why wouldn't you reduce the numbers of field engineers? Like, do you feel there was an alternative here, Ken? The alternative to letting these employed field engineers go, that could have even been a better end result than just going with the contract service providers?
Well, of course, there are options. You can present the options to these guys. They could learn more and become more, let's say, sticky to the organization, but through further training. But the problem is these guys are normally older, and they want to maintain the old status quo where they were the kingpins and didn't have to learn about mobile technology, and they just fixed line problems, etc. I know we're concentrating on just the field engineers, by the way, but there's many other aspects of this, and I think they're symptomatic of all the malaise, let's say, in the organization regarding data-driven culture. But ultimately, they haven't been shown what their value will be if they go and retrain on, for example, radio access network technology, and how that can benefit their career longevity, etc. At the moment, they just see it as they can elongate their career through obfuscation and not getting engaged in the new digital-driven culture, data-driven culture.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, Ken, what we're really saying is we need to be aware of these beliefs before we do the digital transformation, because again, they can scupper the whole success of the transformation.
I think it's critical, Paddy, because if we don't get a picture of what's happening on the ground regarding this digital transformation before we actually communicate it widely, then and get the real needs of these guys as they perceive them. Because they've seen a couple of digital transformations. I think the figure went from an average of 1.2 digital transformations per annum per employee, and it's now up at about 3.4 different digital initiatives per year. So people are being bombarded with digital transformations, and they're not actually, telling people now why you should be engaged in this particular new digital transformation and why it's important to you to be involved. And I think we need to ask these questions.
Yeah, good man, Ken. I just want to go through very quickly maybe some of the comments here, and we'll finish at that point. So Gar McCree's correctly pointing out it's Frank Hannigan, talks about that cultural middleware. I think Brian Hennessy probably referenced that work, and it is a fantastic. Thanks. Gar has a link to it there. Alan agreeing
probably
so much.
Gar.
Yeah. So I think Alan agreeing with you, Ken.
Thanks, Alan.
Data transformation can be really existential threat or crisis for many folks. No one will learn anything when they feel threatened. Noel Carl also agreeing data transformation can be gamed. Also, Noel is
Very
saying.
interesting.
So
Thanks, Noel.
Sharon also has a comment there. What Ken is describing sounds like an anthropology of data practices. Identity is so important. And Noel has further comments there, and also remembers asking an executive on a similar topic: does the data inform the culture, or does the culture inform the data? And I know, again, we've had conversations around that recently as well. Rose saying, I agree, Noel, there are a number of gamification opportunities in the topics raised to date. And also Mark and Gar coming back in there, and also about, I think I see Gar there talking about the story, the role of storytelling, etc. Okay, look, so well, and there's plenty of other comments there as well. I've got through, or I've incorporated as many of them as I could into the questions. So keep the questions going. They're absolutely fantastic. So I think, again, quick switch over to Rory O'Callaghan, Director, Global Command Center at Pfizer.
Thanks,
welcome, Rory.
Thank you, Paddy. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
We can hear you, and we can see the slides as well, Rory.
Good, and you can see him in full screen mode, yeah?
Yeah, now we can see also your comments to the right.
Okay, yeah.
Or your next slide, at least.
How's that?
That's it. Yeah.
Better.
Cool.
Okay, great. So first of all, it's an honor to be here this morning, and it's been some really interesting presentations so far, and some things in them definitely that are resonant to what I'm going to speak about here. Paddy spoke about the messiness of applying some of these frameworks and these ways of doing things in real life. Well, I can promise you, however the slides look, the reality is enormously messy in terms of my story here, at least. So bear with me, and I'll try to tell the story as best I can. So I've been with Pfizer now for over 15 years, and in that period, I've been part of the enterprise infrastructure organization. So essentially, we provide the plumbing, I suppose, on which the applications that run the company operate. And our customers are largely internal, so largely those application teams, those teams that develop and run those applications. So talks of technical debt, Mark, I think we're the kings of technical debt sometimes, I think, in the way we run that infrastructure, and talks of things like field engineers and mindsets and so on as well, can very resonant to my journey, at least, things I've dealt with a lot. Over that period, there are kind of three distinct phases in terms of the journey of enterprise infrastructure at Pfizer. When I joined, it was largely disconnected. So I remember I started in a plant in Lochbeg, a manufacturing plant in Lochbeg, which is down in the Ringaskiddy area. We had a few plants in the Ringaskiddy area at that time, and I started in an infrastructure team there, basically building servers and managing a data center. And about a couple of kilometers away as the crow flies, we had another manufacturing plant in Ringaskiddy, and there was a completely different team there doing the same things we were doing in a totally different way. Okay, so different hardware, different ways of building things, different configurations, different help desks, everything was different. So the first phase of that journey was to standardize. So to standardize on the technology that we used, begin to apply some consistent processes right across all of our sites and plants and facilities. And that was a very laborious and human-led effort. So we had everything was a lot of manual repeated work. Okay, lots and lots of repeat tickets and so on. And the data we had was very siloed and disconnected. Okay, so sitting around the place in access databases, various maybe fairly low sophistication monitoring tools and so on. For the following 10 years, we embarked on I guess the first big phase of transformation. And Ken, what you said about multiple transformations and initiatives per year, yeah, very, very true, of course. But if we zoom out and look at a big phase of transformation for us, we really turned up the dial on standardizing both the technology that we used, and suddenly the technology wasn't just things we built on our own premises. Cloud began to become a more significant factor, be it SaaS or platform as a service, things we built ourselves in the cloud. And the machines began to make an appearance. So some of the kind of lower grade, simpler things we did as a support organization to keep this whole infrastructure running, we began to automate that. Again, very simple, very rudimentary. Big step forward on our process landscape. So Mark, you mentioned ITIL earlier on. So ITIL was the secret really of this transformation, insofar as we really standardized the processes that we executed. And that gave us the foundation on which we could outsource a lot of the work as well. So there was some discussion on outsourcing as well earlier. Yeah, definitely we outsourced a lot of that kind of commoditizable, consistent, standardized work. And we were beginning to connect our data, but we were connecting it largely for kind of retrospective analysis. Okay, so descriptive analytics, telling us after the fact whether things went well or not. In the last couple of years, things have changed fundamentally, and largely that's because of industry factors and what we can do now with technology and so on. But of course, our work on the COVID-19 vaccine was a big catalyst also, because that kind of opened our eyes to how quickly we can move when we really marshal our resources and think differently as a company. So now really a lot of our technology is cloud. We're cloud dominant, and currently running a huge project to move a hell of a lot of our applications, the vast majority of them, out onto cloud. We're pushing further on automation, automating more complex things than we could have automated in the past. Now, still a lot of humans in the mix in terms of keeping this infrastructure running, but more and more automation and more to come. Agile has become the default. So where we worked in a fairly waterfall world previously, now Agile is the default. And not only are we connecting data now, but we're using machine learning more and more on our service data in order to drive more proactive intervention, more predictive actions, to make sure we deliver the best service we possibly can and the most resilient and available service we possibly can. But we're on this journey and we're entering this latest phase where we have our eyes open in terms of what we need to do to make sure that we really capitalize on the opportunities it brings. So we know that if we don't continue to act and continue to transform, we lose visibility of what's going on. The environment is very complex. And again, cloud with its speed and scale mean things appear and disappear in a much shorter time frame than they would have in the past. And the core thing really that we learned, again, primarily through the vaccine trials, but certainly that was just accelerating a trend that already existed, is that there is no time for downtime. There is no room for it. And what's expected in terms of our own customers' experience of using the application, and frankly, the competitive environment we're in, means that we got to make these services as available and as resilient as they possibly can be. So the team I lead is the Global Command Center, and Global Command Center is kind of exactly what you think it would be. So we sit and we monitor the entire environment, make sure everything's running as healthily as it can, that it's performing as it should be. When there is some kind of an emergency, we're the rapid response team, and we communicate what's going on, and make sure that the services are delivering what our customers expect. Command Center was born in the teeth of a hurricane, literally, 2012 Hurricane Sandy, and our go live date happened to be on the date that hit New York and New Jersey, and literally it was born as our data center was underwater. Our key primary global data center was underwater. So that was a baptism of fire for sure. So we got through that, and over time, the team has grown from 4 or 5 people initially up to 30 people now. And in that time, we've been looking to evolve how we operate, from being that kind of break glass unit team to using data and analytics to more proactively monitor environment and identify risks and prevent outages. And we talk about purpose a lot, and it's widely accepted, of course, that people work best when they have that clear sense of purpose. And certainly, we played a central role in the vaccine trial, the COVID vaccine trials, And never before was that purpose more clear and more visceral to our team. So we get a lot of credit for being the fire brigade, okay? Because, you know, when your house is on fire, of course, you like to see the fire team arriving with the water hose. But we're clear-eyed enough to know that if we want to get to the destination highlighted in the previous slide, and if we want to make sure we're playing an active part in getting us to that phase of the journey, that we need to be more than just being good at fixing things when they break. Okay, so we need to be able to get ahead of those situations and fix them before they break, fix them while they're still risks. And the secret of doing so, we believe, lies in our data. So we have no shortage whatsoever of data. So I often, when we're struggling to integrate that data and struggling to get insights out of it, we often talk about the fact that, well, at least we have the data. Okay, so it would be a bigger problem if we hadn't. And bringing that together in a way that we can unlock insights, you know, is the key to becoming that kind of fire prevention inspector and avoiding those outages. And it's possible, right? Because what we know from our analysis is whenever we do have a fire, whenever we do have a problem that stops our business in some way, it always has a fingerprint, a data fingerprint. And that data fingerprint is more often than not discernible before the actual fire starts. So there's generally smoke before there's fire. So in terms of pursuing that, so putting data at the center of how we operate in the command center, and using that to drive a much more proactive, predictive approach to make sure we deliver the most resilient services possible. I've followed an action design research process to do so. Now, when I suppose the genesis of this approach for me anyway was the data business masters that I did back in between 2017 and 19 with Paddy and Dave, and Alan was certainly a very important contributor to that as well. And that unlocked in me a most unexpected passion for design. So I wouldn't have expected that when I started the journey, but certainly I became really intrigued by you know, design thinking and how design mindsets and practices are applied to solve business solutions. But design thinking, you know, well, as the name suggests, right? Design thinking, I felt like I needed something to take design thinking into design doing. And action design research provided that. So I think, and when I say action design research, there's probably half a dozen proximate phrases you can use, right? Design science research, design research, whatever. There are various different variations of it, I suppose, all in the same area. And probably the simplest definition of it is the development of technology solutions to important and relevant business problems. And I think that's you know, fantastically simple and absolutely resonant. But I had a background in IT infrastructure, and I'd spent most of my time at Pfizer, certainly on manufacturing plants. So my instinct is to look for process and to look for a defined process that I can follow. And there was no shortage of that in the literature we reviewed as part of the some of the work we did for the masters. And various steps are offered, but I finalized or landed on a fairly simple one: problem definition, design build, evaluation, as a kind of a looping continuum. And with the really, really important step of reflection, and not a step, actually, an activity that just runs right through the process at every phase. And I'm not, honestly, I'm not a very introspective person, or at least I don't think I am anyway. So reflection was something I had to discipline myself to do, and something I had to literally switch off all the devices, sit down with a piece of paper and actually reflect on key events or key steps along the way in terms of developing this solution. Okay, so that's the process out of the way. Let's move on and talk about a few little vignettes in terms of what I learned through that process. First of all, problem definition. And remember, I said, you know, it's a kind of a looping thing, right? Problem definition, design build, and so on. But you know, there comes a point certainly where you got to define a problem or begin that process at least. And what I was planning to do, to bring a lot of service health data that we had together to build this solution that would help us be more predictive. You know, that grew legs fairly quickly. So I guess I was at the very outset of this project. I was trying to secure funding for it, trying to be expansive in the vision. Okay, the usual campaigning in poetry. So it definitely grew arms and legs, and almost ran away from me. Okay, so before we knew it, the problem had sprawled quite a bit. So much so that I was really struggling to figure out where to start. Okay, I felt like, well, okay, I've sold this thing, we've got some funding for it now, we can move ahead. How do we actually start here and deliver something that can be compelling? So apologies in advance for the fairly lame vegetable metaphors. I used the carrot of a rapid MVP, something that could be delivered super quick. Okay, quicker I think than maybe our stakeholders would expect it. And peel back the layers of that onion. Okay, envisage it like an onion. Again, using a technique Paddy shared on the masters. Envisage it like an onion and peeled right back to a pea-sized piece of functionality. Basically, are we healthy or not? And we knew we could get the data to show that. We knew we could analyze it, visualize it, you know, in a fairly rapid time. So that problem pea rather than a problem onion. And you know, we moved ahead, developed that MVP. You know, the usual messiness applied, of course, developing it and getting it over the line. But ultimately, it was successful, and we received funding to take it further. And ever since, I consider that the problem we're looking to solve as an onion. So we're adding back in the layers now, phase by phase, adding them back in, and building back up to that expansive vision that we had. Now, it wasn't straightforward, okay? So you've sold something that's, like I said, expansive, and suddenly you're looking to dial it back in. So we had to use speed. Okay, we had to use the fact that we'll deliver this really, really quickly, and that it will be tangible and usable as a means to negotiate down to the pea-sized piece of functionality. Okay, move on. So again, I spoke about a looping continuum, and again, my background, okay, and I come from a waterfall background, I suppose, initially, and again, the manufacturing environment, highly validated, and so on. The orthodoxy there is that you don't jump to solutions. You need to spend time exhaustively defining each element of your problem before you can build anything. And you know, that can, as we know, that can be the enemy of action. And I've been involved in several projects whereas I wouldn't characterize them as failures. Certainly, I think they could have delivered more value than they did. And often the problem was that we spent so much time defining the problem, okay, and really telling ourselves, no, we can't solution now until we know the problem. That often we became wed to the idea of what the problem was, and consequently wed to an idea of what the solution must be. And often those solutions didn't hit the mark. So in this particular project, you know, I was determined not to fall into that trap again. And doing can be very, very simple. Okay, doing for me, or building for me was generally drawing, actually, in the early stages. Some pretty poor sketches, to be honest, you know, some very, very, very low fidelity stuff. And looking to iterate through those into maybe, you know, as they resonate, I show them to people as they resonated, maybe iterating into something then a little bit higher fidelity, to zero in on what we're looking to deliver. And often negative reactions, that little image you see there, the top image there, yeah, that got a hopeless reaction altogether. You know, that didn't curry favor with the people I showed it to. And because of in my own mindset and the team's mindset, we were almost in this kind of playful kind of just drawing things and throwing them out there. Something that would have been crushing in the past. Oh my God, one of our key stakeholders thinks this is hopeless. Wasn't, you know, it was just a drawing. It didn't matter. You know, it was throwaway essentially. And that was undoubtedly has been absolutely key to making sure that we zero in and build the right thing here in the solution that we're building. Okay, evaluation and reflection. I mentioned to you that, you know, I don't think I'm naturally all that introspective. It's something I have to discipline myself to do. And when we're building this thing for command center, if you think of what a command center is, or certainly when I think of what a command center is, you kind of think about almost air traffic control or kind of military kind of images, this idea of lots of screens with green and red and blinking lights and so on. And the theory I had was that if we built something, the initial theory at least, built something that was, looked great, and was kind of pleasurable to look at as much as anything else, then that the other things we needed to happen, i.e. people to really believe in this, and the people we needed to use it to execute on it and to really apply themselves to it, would follow. So we built some of our initial prototypes. We built things with maps and radar sweeps and blinking lights and those things that you imagine it might need to be. And we got an initial bounce. So the command center team, they used it for a while, but after a while, they kind of slipped back into the kind of the way they had worked before. And that initial bounce didn't really last. So we needed to get inside their heads essentially and figure out what it is that they could make the most use out of and that they would continue to consistently use. I did so through surveys, simple surveys, chats. Interviews would probably be too fancy a term for them. Just sitting with them and chatting through them. Bit of shoulder surfing as well, so watching them as they use a solution. And what we learned was that the people who work in the command center, they're kind of unique, okay? So they've got a high tolerance for bad news for a start, because generally when people engage you or need your help, it's bad news. They're the people who kind of run toward the fire rather than away from it. And as well, they get their dopamine hit from fixing things, okay? They get their dopamine hit from putting out the fire, being that fire team and putting out the fire. They're that kind of unusual people who enjoy that, who actually get a kick from that. And here we are asking them to actually detect the fires before they occur, and put them out, and do it in this kind of very technical, data-driven way. And it just wasn't hitting the spot with them. So as we discussed it more with the team, what we discovered is, well, first of all, they're used to working in a kind of an inbox type world, right? Where things come into their inbox, they look at them, they figure them out, they do something with them, they fix the problem, and it moves out of the inbox, and then something else comes into the inbox. So if we wanted them to do proactive, predictive work like this, we needed to actually disguise it as reactive work. We needed to create an inbox type experience rather than a radar map type experience. It needed to be simple. Okay, so we're asking a team to go from a scenario where people are asking them for help and telling them what they need, to where they have these risks that may or may not become a problem that they need to interpret. And we need to keep evolving it to maintain interest. So we, frequent releases, and we intentionally, as we release this to the team, we release little bits at a time. Agile mentality, of course, but little bits at a time, honestly, so that we'll have more to release in a couple more weeks' time. Okay, so it's an evolving thing and it's a living thing, and that in itself maintains interest and engagement. And finally, some measurement and reward, making sure that we actually measure work, proactive work, and reward it, because the reward is obvious if you put out a fire. Okay, the fire is out and everybody's really happy the fire is out. The reward is less obvious when you detect the fire and put it out. Okay, it's less visceral. So we needed to make sure that we could that we were measuring that and rewarding that and recognizing that as well. And the results have been really positive. Last year alone, 1,100 proactive interventions. That's 1,100 cases where we might have had some kind of an interruption to a critical business process. Many of those on our COVID-19 efforts as well, which is key. And again, like I mentioned earlier, purpose. The team really believes that they have a connection to purpose stronger than they would have had previously. When I talk about build, well, you can prototype or build just about anything, and this is, I suppose, maybe slightly tangential to the kind of core job of building this data solution. But one of the things we found was that as a team, we were having some difficulties making decisions And obviously, when you're building something and trying to affect the transformation in terms of how your team works as well, yeah, there's a lot of difficult decisions to make. And we found that we were having problems, first of all, with getting to a decision, and secondly, more importantly, with sticking with the decision. So we were lucky enough to have some design thinking experts within our organization that we could bring in to help us in a workshop. And they arrived, of course, with boxes of Lego, and cue eye rolls in the room, when the Lego was broken out. But anyway, we stuck with it and put any reservations we had aside, and got to building on that yellow panel on the left hand side. Got to building our view of what the current problem was, and it was hard. It was hard for us, wily old infrastructure operations veterans to actually build something on Lego, to put any doubts aside, and to put in physical form what was a very kind of a interpersonal type issue. But we did. We were able to build some of the key elements of that problem. The fact that we felt a lot of peer pressure, okay, that there was a lot of other organizations that were really dependent on us and had ideas as to how we should evolve and how we should transform. We built the magic roundabout, the fact that we seemed to go round and round and round when we were debating these issues. And the barking dog. Ultimately, we decided that our wicked problem was to represent that as a barking dog. And that barking dog was the need to actually get through the roundabout and get this problem solved or get this decision made. And then we got to building, after we'd kind of built that and reviewed that, we got to building what we thought, good decision-making process would look like. So you see those green and red blocks in the middle, that's our little effort at a kind of a bar chart representative of a kind of a structured assessment process, bringing more structure to how we discussed various options to help us make a decision. The circle of trust, which was a key item. So making sure that, once we did actually get to consensus, that we all, entered the circle of trust and stuck with it. And while we traveled down the alleyway of commitment to the prize. And look, you look at it like this, and this thing looks a bit, I guess, abstract and a bit silly, perhaps. But this is 2.5 years old now. This is just before actually all travel stopped for obvious reasons. And though this thing is long dismantled and in a box, it's still a part of our day-to-day discussion. We still often reference it when we're making decisions. We didn't build a standard operating procedure or some kind of a detailed document off the back of this. It's resonant and it's stuck in our heads. And this little bit of building helped us solve a problem we had and helped us affect a lot of the transformation that we've been working to affect since. Okay, so finally, and I know, buddy, I've chewed up a lot of time here. Finally, it's not all champagne and roses when I talk about action design research. There was an obvious piece missing in that process I outlined, and that's research contribution. And I recognize the importance of it, but I struggle with it. Just personally, I struggle with it sometimes. I struggle sometimes with the fact that it can be subjective. It can be very much in the eye of the beholder. It's not something that detains me every day, right? It's not something that's forefront of my thoughts. But I know at the same time, if I'm on this action design research journey, then I should be thinking about research contribution and looking to make that contribution. And that's something I'm still wrestling with for sure. And that is it in terms of slides. Happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Well done, Rory. And I can see again from the comments here coming through the various channels is I think people really appreciating that messy story, the story of what maybe a messy practitioner research journey can be like, and I think there's some lovely comments in it. I think this idea of shoulder surfing, trying to figure out what's what. Also, I think what really resonates is this idea of don't get overly married, to the problem that and that reframing. Even though you talk to people, it seems like there are really different problems, but at the core, what is the core, that pea-sized thing? And in your case, it was essentially, are we healthy? But actually, it then transpires that just knowing we're not healthy sometimes isn't enough to drive a reaction, because like you were saying, sometimes we're defined and our identity is defined by putting the fires out. So we wait for the fire. So in then trying to flip that and nearly even, I suppose, design from a behavioral point of view, that you give nearly as much of a dopamine hit to people by preempting and making sure the fires don't occur. And I really like that's a really rich story of using data, not just as a reactionary element, but a proactive element. And I can see just from the comments here, Rory, you know, Ken is talking about, yeah, look, in some cases that we have to take all the data and we nearly need to drink the fire hose to get to this proactive approach to understanding what's what. Gar is talking about, love the problem. I think you might be saying, be careful, don't overlove the problem, that it nearly emerges through the walls of trying to solve the problem, sometimes causes you to reframe the problem. So I also see Ken back in here about scope creep, and also the importance of monitoring it in the risk assessment register. Resigo, and I'd reiterate what Resigo say, very well done, very elaborate ADR process, but I think really well explained. I can see, Mark here talking about, the use of the problem solution loop, and that idea, the problem emerging through the solution emerging through the problem. Actually, I think you've got a lot of reaction here, which is always a good sign. So Keith Drummond, looks like a great journey, Rory, nice job, and agree that reflection is key to ensuring you are solving the right problem. And I think it's absolutely, Keith, you're spot on, and I think it's absolutely critical to that practitioner research approach that we're talking about. The hero culture really resonating again with Ken, and I think he's found something very similar in his research, and you're calling it out there. How do you deal, and actually how do you allow someone be the hero when they're used to being the hero? And Sharon Jones, your insights are really powerful. The hero syndrome and putting the fire out really resonates. Your responsive approach is really interesting, and how you have made it stick. And Gar, I nearly predicted this. Gar, loving the Lego, and also, that you nearly need to do it to understand it. And sometimes people's initial reaction is, sure, what, this is playing, this is, this isn't going to get us any further. But I would again concur with Gar. Sometimes you need to experience to see what impact something like Lego serious play can have. And Rose, thank you, Rory. It was lovely seeing the onion and peas again. Okay, and I think we're close to Elaine. Very interesting. Thanks, Rory. Particularly like the Lego and the comments on research contribution. And I think, sorry, Alan has a comment. I missed it going down there as well. Willingness to reframe is critical. The what changes based on the why and for whom. But the why might also emerge as to do something different to what we originally conceived. And that's that lovely waltz, you have to nearly partake in the waltz to allow both problem and solution to coive. I know that's something that Alan would have also been, I think, intrigued when we went through the sessions on with different companies in the room, during some of those practitioner research sessions that we've ran. Rory, again, thanks so much. I think there's lots of sort of takeaways there for the audience, and also maybe worth just keeping an eye on the chat there as well, Rory. Some really nice comments.
Terrific comments and insights. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for your input as well, Rory. So I think we're over to Sharon now. Hello, Sharon.
Yeah,
good stuff, Sharon. So hopefully we'll be able to share screens and all there on your side, Sharon.
Yeah, let's have a go.
Let's have a go. Something's happening here now, Sharon. All right.
That's useful to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can everyone see where I'm starting here?
Yeah, so we can see them now, Sharon, here.
Let me just see if I can get into presentation mode here, guys. Can anyone help me with presentation mode? I can't see. I'm not sure what you're seeing.
So we're still seeing it out of presentation mode. So normally that icon sort of down the bottom right, just to the left of the Zoom option, Sharon. So I can just see.
I'm not doing very well. I'm sorry, guys. I'm used to Teams, so this is a bit of a new version for me. Sorry, hang on. You might have to live with this because otherwise I could spend the next.
No,
10 minutes.
that's okay. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry guys. Live with me then, and my you can see I'm not a technology person. It's become pretty clear. So what I'm trying to talk about here today is design thinking mindset, and if it's a real thing. And it's been absolutely fascinating listening to the conversation so far. I can hear so much of what you're saying resonate in some of the work that I'm doing. So I'm actually registered for a PhD at the moment with UCC, the Business School, and the School of Education as a joint registration. And I'm looking at design thinking as a kind of core subject matter area. But I'm also a practitioner in working in higher education, more generally in transformation, but also trying to bring a design thinking mindset into that space. So what I'm going to give you now is really quite raw. You're the first people to see any of this, and it's the initial kind of findings from research that I've been conducting. It's more descriptive than analytical at the moment, because that's the next phase that I'm just about to move into. But I think there's a couple of things that will come out here that might be of interest to all of you, actually, based on the conversations that you've just been having about people and change and culture and problem framing and so on. So I'm going to run through a bunch of slides. I'm going to take a little bit of a punt and assume that most people have some idea about design thinking. So I'm not going to go in any depth about what it is, but I thought it would be worthwhile just a short history. And I mean that in a really short history, and then work through what I'm doing and what I've been finding. There's quite a few slides here, which most of them are appendices. So if we share the slides later, they might be useful to colleagues to access some resources and some other ideas, but the main slide deck should be reasonably short. So just on the short history,
so you're just gone on to mute, Sharon. Yeah, back again, yeah. And we just lost you again, Sharon. Yeah.
Okay.
That's, yeah, perfect.
Great. I was going to say that the history of the design thinking movement, as it's sometimes referred to, goes back much before Simon, actually, probably back to the 50s. And it's linked to movements in the German art movement between Bauhaus and the Ulm School of Design, but not to get too much into that depth. But the infinity loop that you've just been talking about in problem solution really is a symbol from the Ulm School of Design, which is interesting. If you go to Simon, Herbert Simon, you'll find that his idea of design thinking is still quite linear. And I think that partly is because it comes out of the engineering school of thought. If you move to Richard Buchanan, he's really starting to get that sense of design moving from a product, or, you know, the lipstick or the frilly bits on the end of a product, to becoming much more about interactive services and ultimately whole systems. And I think this is the end of the spectrum that we're now talking about when we talk about design thinking. We're really in the interaction and into the whole question of complex systems and the role that design plays in that context. And I think I'd just bring you back to the Krippendorf and Butter text on the semantic turn. And they're really talking about that paradigm shift of design as an artifact, moving it out into more about meaning than simply function. And I think that mirrors the transition from, you know, a sort of a manufacturing-based economy into a service economy and into an experience economy. And that's why I think design thinking is starting to really resonate. And you'll see various companies. Now my battery's decided to run out. Just perfect, isn't it? But you're going to have to excuse me. I'm going to have to get my lead.
That's cool. So just for those watching, that we have different people that have adopted different approaches towards practitioner research. So there's no one and only one way to practitioner research. We have seen Rory there talk about action design research, which is very much about, you know, designing a solution, and I suppose it then generating knowledge through that very process. We've also others here that are some doing PhDs that are maybe adopting different approaches towards practitioner research. Sometimes action research, which is more about reflection on your own experiences or the experiences of others. So back over to you again, Sharon.
Sorry, I'm obviously not having a good day with technology and various things. So just the framing of design as a discipline and as a practice has moved from, you know, a manufacturing type base into a more experience economy, service-based economy dimension. And there's two main models in the design thinking world in terms of both its conceptualization and its method. And this has been evolving actually since, you know, the 70s and 80s, but I think the most prominent is probably the IDEO and the Stanford D School methodology, which many of you may recognize. And I think their original definition in this space is about design thinking as a process for creative problem solving. But you'll see that's gradually changing, and they're updating it now to be a human-centered approach for innovation that draws on design based on the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. You can see that shifting a much more nuanced and much more connected way of thinking about people and technology and business success, rather than just focusing down on a problem. And they're saying that in particular it draws on the mindset that skilled designers cultivate to unlock creativity and so on. And why is it important? Well, Tim Brown, who's the founder of IDEO and actually previously from Stanford D School, is saying that basically it gives you a competitive edge. And I think a lot of the literature now is taken up that mantra of the management literature, which is that design thinking is the new way of creating innovation, not just from inside the company, but because it connects with the customers, and your customers are now a new source of innovation for organizations. So it's really moving us into a new era of production. That's the basis of the IDEO model. The other dominant model is the double diamond, which has come from the UK Design Council. And it's been around for some time. But again, it's a similar starting point of problem solving form and function, although they include style. But again, they're starting to update their thinking around design thinking and its principles. And they're talking about a framework now. And you can see how they have moved into a model where they're bringing the context into play. So the organizational domain in which the activity is taking place becomes very important, and talking about thinking about the ideal work and culture that's needed in order to have that significant and long-lasting change. So I think I'm just trying to stress out here about going from problem solving as a kind of the emphasis of design thinking to a much more nuanced and complex idea around the delivery of change, organizational, cultural, and the impact on organizations for business success. I just want to add one other comment here, and this is from Jean Leitka. This is her view of design thinking, and she draws out human biases as her kind of essence in terms of her thinking in the space, because she's particularly interested in social impact rather than the commercial aspects. So I think it's an interesting model to call out here, just to give another nuanced look on what the IDEO Stanford D School model is and the UK Council. I think it's just worthwhile pulling that out. And we'll see why that might be important later on. If you're in doubt about any of these methodologies and their value to businesses, I think there's lots of information and data around now in management literature about mergers and acquisitions, reports and studies by consultancies that demonstrate companies are increasingly acquiring or merging with design organizations, design agencies, and bringing them into the business as a core part of their business model. I think there's also evidence, they said, I'm not sure they're all completely clear about what they're doing with those skills and capabilities and so on, but it certainly is a trend. And Alan from Gartner, I'm sure you'll have plenty of access to resources on your side, which can demonstrate what's happening in that space. But it's an interesting space. And there's a recent article research from Imperial College and other universities in Europe where they have collaborated, looking at the way in which organizations are actually utilizing design thinking. And it's quite interesting that some are using it for change, some are using it for strategizing, and various other aspects of their business. So it's being taken up and utilized in quite different ways, depending on the business need of the company, which I think demonstrates some flexibility, but also demonstrates an emerging kind of way in which organizations see design thinking as of benefit to them. So that's all very interesting, but what's my research problem in my thesis? Well, I spent about a year, and you talk about messy front ends, I spent a year probably looking at a lot of stuff written by designers about design and design thinking, and figuring out what was all fuss about, and particularly the row between the managerial-led narrative around design thinking as an imperative and a competitive advantage, and the designer community here basically saying design thinking is bullshit, as one commentator says on a TED Talk. And that challenge between two disciplines, essentially, one arguing that design is their subject and therefore belongs to designers, and management starting to talk about design and design thinking as something that everyone should be interested in and therefore legitimate part of their interest. And there's certainly two literatures here that are worth exploring if you want to find and follow the arguments about the value of design thinking. There's certainly a narrative going through both literatures, though, about a mindset being essential in the design thinking space. And then questions about what is it and how might it be measured. You can see that the IDEO mindset model is about embracing empathy, optimism, and so on. The Design Council talks more vaguely. I think the Design Council talks more vaguely on a lot of these things, although the Design Council in 2015 was really disruptive by awarding the Designer of the Year award to a social scientist and not to a designer from a design school. So I think they're still struggling about where design thinking sits in the design domain. And the Stanford D School, I beg your pardon. The Stanford D School, sorry, that's just jumped, is talking about a set of vital attitudes for the design thinker, but doesn't really say what they might be. So there's the basis of my research is really to start digging in to see where might this design thinking mindset reside, real or imagined, and is there any evidence to support it? So my curiosity started back in probably 2016, I think, probably, when I was doing service redesign, transforming the student experience in UK universities. I'm really interested also from the idea of business value and that comment that Ken made earlier about 70% of projects fail. Well, if this is the case, what on earth are we doing over here in the UK universities, investing millions of pounds on reforming and transforming the student experience without really thinking about the methodologies in our approach? So a service design methodology was adopted with reasonable success, but again, cultural pushback is an important aspect of that. I was also struck by this lack of evidence. It's being pursued. Is it a trend? Is it a fad? Like his work here, and Kolko saying it's absolutely essential now. And he was one of the most important, hesitant kind of adopters of design thinking as a management and as a business need. And also a surprise that Hasso Plattner, who's actually one of the founding members of SAP and also a D School academic and promoter of design thinking, when he wrote in 2015 that design thinking is ready to become a foundational science for engineering. And I thought, well, what were they doing before? So it was slightly a surprise to hear that in engineering, design thinking, or at least designing for a more user-centered approach, was not foundational in the discipline, which maybe shouldn't have surprised me, but as a social scientist, it did surprise me. And just bringing your whole person to the room, as we talk about in the design thinking world, I'm just giving some background here on where I'm coming from. So we've got design thinking, there's an idea of mindset, there's no evidence for mindset, and I'm curious. So I link up with UCC, who have got their postgraduate diploma on innovation through design thinking. And I have been interviewing students on that program last year and this year. I think it's just important to draw out that this program is quite unique. I'm talking about it as an immersive experience because it's not a boot camp. It's not a 2-day or a 3-day or a 5-day sprint. It's an intensive 12-week structured, academic-led, practice-based immersion into design thinking in semester 1. And in semester 2, it moves on to take the action design research methodology and then apply that very much in a practice-based context as well. So the interesting thing about this program is these students are brought together in groups, very deliberately chosen to be a mix of students in each group, who are then asked to come up with a design challenge based around the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're let loose into the wild, I think is the UCC term, with a set of tools and techniques and instruction and guidance and so on to take them through a full design activity over that 12-week period. So the first cohort I interviewed, I have to say, were fascinating range of students, from new graduates up to very experienced practitioners leading innovation labs in organizations. And I just wanted to illustrate here the kind of the messiness of the kind of experience. This is not in any way scientific, but it reflects what they were saying about their journey. And I think the things that I would pull out here is the empathy, point of view and framing aspects of the design thinking approach, which is kind of very much at that front end of the double diamond, or at the front end of the Stanford D methodology, which is saying basically, you have to empathize and get into the space and understand the problem, or in design council terms, you have to discover and define. A lot of discombobulation, to put the scientific term on it, a lot of stress around team working, and a lot of uncertainty around interpretation and tool selection. And this was probably the most interesting period in which the students were struggling with their learning and their engagement with each other. The reasons for that we might come on to in a moment. Struggling with concepts at the start, that's not unusual. This is standard educational understanding about new students coming in and about the sort of, the trough of despondency with new ideas, but then as they start to grow and get to grips. And you can see also some students really taking to the kind of point of view, empathy and framing aspect, and some students really struggling with that. And why might that be? We've also got the team working aspect, and this seems self-evident and almost banal to call it out, but I think we really have to focus on this if we're serious about taking a design thinking mindset out of the classroom and into the workspace. I think tool interpretation is really linked to around mastery and confidence and so on. And prototype and co-creation, again, interesting, but much less problematic, and probably part of a journey of coming out of what I think here is what we're seeing is a liminality of a transition and of understanding. I think by the time you get to this prototyping and co-creating, you can see more of what's happening in the student learning experience. What are the emergent themes? I'm just calling these out. They're not based on coding as yet. They're very much at the open coding end of the analysis that I'm currently doing with the first cohort, and seem to be repeating with the second cohort who I've just finished interviewing. That these are the kind of key areas around feeling creative, feeling fear of failure. The empathy is really important, and shifts in perception. You can see that going on in the conversations that I had with students. So my interviews have been open-ended and semi-structured, taking more hermeneutic approach, which is allowing the student to talk about their experience. I'm not interested in assessing the teaching or the content or the quality of the learning environment. It's about the student experience of the learning. I think this might resonate with Ken and others based on what you guys have just been discussing about some of the challenges of implementing change. There's a real call out around empathy and point of view with compassion, because with compassion says it's also a call to action. And I think the model here, which is taken from a journal of psychology, is people, the students in this call were really wedded in this space, and they came from various walks of life, disciplines, all graduates, different life experiences, different levels of professional working experience and so on. But you could see that transition from moving what we see to getting into the reaction of the situation, which is where the point of view and the listening, the attentive listening, the more anthropological aspects of the design thinking experience when you are out in the field trying to understand the problem, which is the fundamental first requirement of a design thinker. What is the problem? Or another way to put it, if this is the proposed solution, why is this? That then would suggest a certain type of problem and iterating through problem solution. And I think it's interesting that dominant view of problem solving is starting to, I think, recede slightly in the narrative around design thinking, because it does come from a rather techno-scientific dominant mindset. And if you look at some of the later work on studio pedagogy and the way in which designers think, they don't start with a problem. They start with a solution, but they use it in an iterative way. It's very much a two-way flow. So it does change the way of thinking and the way of entering into the domain, if you like, to engage with stakeholders and understand their needs and opportunities for solution. And then I think as the students talked to me, as they dug deeper into what was going on, why this empathy and point of view was so important in the design thinking process, you really get down into the sense of beliefs and past experiences and preferences, how they then were reflective on their own stance in these spaces. And I think that is one of the most profound aspects to come out of the research that I've done so far. But to understand that is now my challenge. And there's a few slides in this deck where students I've called them out. By the way, the names are fictitious, so there's obviously anonymity here. But, you know, Ronan here experiences this as deconstructing himself. He was very adamant in this space about what he thought the problem was. And as he went through his experience of design thinking and searching and understanding user needs, he described it as not just deconstructing the problem, but deconstructing himself. And Isaiah has had a similar experience, talking about that experience as transformative, really seeing things in a different way. So there's quite a bit of interesting research, I think, to be now taken on in the next step of what I'm doing, is not just understanding that and through my interpretation and analysis of this, but the next stage is in, I'll be following up these cohorts to see what sticks. Does any of this stick? You know, the strategy being able to survive the first contact with the enemy. The other thing to call out is fear of failure and creativity. This diagram is actually taken from a sports psychology context, but it really resonates with what students were saying to me. The rebuilding of the creative self, as one experienced it, and the other as a challenge. Now, Alex here is challenging because wasn't able to move out of this space and actually just about managed to complete the course, could not move into this space for reasons that she described in her feedback to me. Dee's experience here was absolutely transformative. And actually what this is about, rebuilding the creative self, was also overcoming a tendency to perfection, but also a command and control culture, as she described it in her current work environment. So I think there's something really important about fear of failure. And for one student, this actually went right back to school. And as a result of doing the course, has actually now decided to set up her own business, which is quite an interesting leap of change of mind. The third thing to call out, I think, as I said, the team dynamic and learning as a team, theory and practice. I think the design team model that was that ran through the course was interesting. It was deliberately a group of students put together without leadership or roles specifically called out for the team then to work together. One found it incredibly empowering, another found it absolutely frustrating and inefficient. And there's anywhere in between that spectrum in terms of experience. But what it calls out to me is we all think we work in teams, we talk about working in teams, but one of the challenges that a lot of students mentioned was the fact that there was no hierarchy in the room. We're so used to working in a hierarchical environment. How do we change that culture in a dynamic creative team environment so that as many ideas and as many challenges can be called out? Because that's the essence of the design thinking space, to get as many ideas as possible to then look at possible solutions. but that there is a definite issue around how that then is lived in experience in organizations. And I'm finding it in my own work context at the moment. And I think actually the Hasso-Plattner team, who are based in Potsdam at the HPI Institute, are actually now starting to look at teams in a design thinking context and how they are created and empowered to work together. So I think this is going to be an interesting area of further investigation as I dig down into the analysis of what the students are calling out. I wanted to call out these three areas as a kind of the pinnacle of what I was hearing from the students. I can't do it justice in this space, but the power and the impact on the individuals of this experience is really profound. This is very one-dimensional. This was 360-degree dimensional impact. So when you're talking about the projects and the experiences that you've had in organizations, if we can find a way to build empathy and point of view into a culture, which is a rush to solution culture quite often in a managerial sense, and pause and take time in the problem space to listen to users, to empathize and to analyze and to dig deeper, I think we will all benefit as organizations and as people working together. I think this is absolutely fundamental, but hard to do in an organizational context. Fear of failure and creativity, I think this is another aspect that we can effectively challenge. I think it's, again, the prototyping aspect of design thinking really encourages a release of the fear of failure. And as one student said, really interestingly, sure, we didn't have to be afraid of failure because with that bank of ideas from our ideation phase, we could always go back there, which I thought was a nice way to resonate around that particular issue. And the team working is absolutely fundamental in an organizational context. So where's the academic background on this? There's two studies, most recent, that have actually really tried to tackle this question about design thinking mindset. Is it real? What does it look like? I've mapped them here and I've called out in red where I think I'm seeing aspects in the responses from students that I've interviewed, which really resonate with this, with both these studies. You'll see Dozy calls them constructs and Schweitzer calls them mindsets. But they are based on literature review, interviews with design leads, innovation leads in organizations. So there's pretty robust research that sits behind this. So we're starting to see an emergent idea that actually has got some evidence base about capabilities that we should look for in design thinking, teaching and learning interventions, and ultimately how then we need to perhaps cultivate teams to get this combination of learning within a productive and dynamic team in our organizations. The question about so what? Well, so what? I think from an educational point of view, we can all see you could spend your life doing boot camps and design thinking and being in networks and so on. I think the coming of age of design thinking isn't quite here yet. I think it is about a more nuanced and more deliberate approach to the design of the educational experience. It picks out some of the things that I've just mentioned above, but also putting them into context. I'm interesting that Rory put ADR and design thinking together. I think design thinking is still lacking something of a rigorous framework for application. But I think we also need to resonate with the people going through the experience as a liminal kind of, a passage, a rite of passage from very much solution-driven, thinking we know top-down problem space to finding the problem and understanding the individuals and their needs and what they're trying to do and trying to seek to achieve. So I think there's a real challenge there in terms of power relations within an organizational structure and what that means for how we work together. So my ultimate takeaway from this first piece of research is that I think design thinking needs to be reframed as a concept. I think it draws on what IDEO says, but I would add in the Leitka comments about beliefs and challenges to the individual kind of sense of being, which is about, it's problem solving, but before solving, it's finding, it's that iteration we were talking about. It's about the toolkit, it's about needs, and it's about possibilities of technology, but it also challenges biases, behaviors, and institutional cultures that inhibit success. And I'll go back to Ronan's point about deconstructing the self and then reconstructing the self in the context of recognizing biases and behaviors that were inhibiting him from being innovative. And I think the importance for the research hopefully will be to contribute to, you know, an increased understanding of what we're teaching, how students are learning, and what that might mean for professional development in the context of organizational culture and inclusivity. So those are my main points, and I apologize for my technical chill out earlier. I have some other slides here which I can share with colleagues. These are obviously standard photos, but just to give you a sense of the human impact of the experience. If anybody wants to share the slides, I'm very happy to do so afterwards.
Thanks, Sharon. So some really interesting, I suppose, ideas in there, Sharon, and some really nice emergent insights from the research. So I think there's a lot of comments come in, Sharon, though, and again, what you're saying resonating with a lot of people. I'll leave you maybe go through yourself, Sharon. We're slightly caught on time. I think it's interesting as well, just one sort of comment, not necessarily question, but I think we can look at it from the point of view of the individual within an organization. But I think there's also a challenging of the identity itself of the organization, in the same way as the identity of the individual is challenged by it. You know, I think that's really interesting. Also, I think the concept of empathy is interesting, but really the likes of, and I think Rory's is very interesting in that regard. We can understand individuals, but when those individuals have conflicting needs, desires, now you need something more than empathy to really be to referee or to make those big design decisions, you know. And I think sometimes we overemphasize it's all about empathy, but it's actually how you then utilize those different understandings of different individuals that could have really conflicting views is really, for me, a key indicator of a level that we need to get through design thinking, action design research. I think if we're down here, it's fine. It's maybe the fluffy stuff, but it's when you have to then try and reconcile, make sense. So I'm just going to leave those thoughts to know. I
think that's what I'm saying about the power relations, Paddy. It really does challenge it. And actually, I think there's an interesting area of research around institutional mindset as well, which can take us into that space. You can use design thinking, I think, to analyze that. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting hearing other colleagues. So thank you for your time. I'm really interested if anyone wants to share experiences, because I will definitely benefit from the thoughts of colleagues on this call. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And I think it's now over to Mr. Gar McChrista. Gar wears different hats on different days. It's hard sometimes to keep up with him. I see here we're listing him as chairperson of the Public Health Advisory Committee at the Linux Foundation Public Health, but I know that's one of many hats that Gar wears. So Gar, hopefully you're still with us there.
Managed to unmute myself. I am. How are you?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
So, given the timing, so I'm going to jump straight in, and I work as a digital advisor in the HSE for the Chief Information Officer, which basically means for the past 2 years I've done stuff to do with COVID, followed by stuff to do with cyber, and looks like stuff to do with Ukraine now. So it's been kind of a bit of a race in terms of stuff that's going on. And as I guess this has been an ongoing conversation with Paddy and Mark and Ken and others on this call as well, in that as I look back at what we had done within this kind of very unique time, it was trying to figure out what was going on and what we could learn from it. So and I've been in part of Paddy's hedge school with Ken and Mark, and Elaine's on the call as well. There's some others there too. And that was kind of bringing in aspects of action research. So I started journaling, I started reflecting on kind of the stuff that was going on to try and make sense of what it was we could learn from this really interesting time. And then along the way, so I'm a huge basketball fan. I'm just going to declare that up front. And the Golden State Warriors, well, Steve Kerr, when he was with the Chicago Bulls, the Golden State Warriors, he's now the head coach of, he got interviewed by Jon Stewart, and it was a fascinating interview. And he described the way that the Golden State Warriors played. So they've been champion 3 times. They've got some of the best players in the world on their team, but he described it as fast, loose, and disciplined, which is the way that, and something resonated with me about that. So that idea of working fast, loose, as in you're dealing or catering for uncertainty, but there's a discipline to the way you work. So it kind of described the quality of the way they play. And I'm going to use play instead of work just for the remainder of this talk, just in terms of describing what we were doing and how and why it kind of fit into the way we were thinking about the work we were doing at that point in time. He also described another characteristic of it as they played with joy, and you can see it. So you can see a team that's, and pick any sport, you can see a team that's really struggling with things, and you can see a team that really enjoys what they're doing. And there's a joyfulness to the way they work. So I'm going to go back for a second and go on a little bit of crack, because we're here, and actually I'm going to destroy everybody's day. And this is probably the only thing you'll remember from today. I looked up the etymology of the word crack, and it actually comes from an old English word, right? And it was a description of people speaking loudly in a corner. So it's not ours. We've only had it since, it was Sean Bon Brannock who brought it in the 60s. So just to disillusion everybody today, crack is not ours. It's actually someone else's. But this idea of fast, loose, and disciplined made me think, and sorry, Mark, I've ruined Mark's day now. I can see, Gar, you are no crack. So it made me think about what we were doing and how we were working. So I'm going to introduce you to the Davies-McCreaston matrix. So this is, so Charlie Davies is a friend of mine, and he does a lot of work in the area of clarity. So how to help people get clear on things. So Charlie's axis is the y-axis. So at one end, you've got clear, and at the other end, you've got drama. So it's not clarity in the absence of clarity. When you're not clear, it turns into drama. And then Gar's axis is, and Mark, I'm gonna fight with you on this one, crack and no crack. So what we want is, we'd love if everybody was in that top right-hand corner, but they're not. We'll come back to this in a little while. So first, I'm going to quickly poke the bear on this. And these were kind of provocations that I have been trying with people just to see how they react. Plans are for people who don't know what they're doing. Governance is to stop the ignorant from doing silly and/or dangerous things. And slavish, context-free adherence to frameworks and methodologies is a surefire recipe for catastrophe. Okay, just sit with that feeling for a second and see if any of those kind of book with your view of the world. So I'm not saying planning is bad, and I'm not saying governance is bad. I'm saying how we've chosen to think about these things is bad. And I'd also like to point out, I am probably the most promiscuous methodologist and framework adherent out there. I love them, right? I dig into them. I love them. I love playing with them. I love figuring out where they connect. I think they're useful, but it's not all. And I don't think it works. And part of the reason for the, I guess, kind of looking at this piece was a realization that, so if I give you 2 examples, so I led the team that delivered the COVID tracker app, and we built that app 3 times in 100 days and delivered it, right? And we didn't follow any frameworks. We didn't follow any process. We didn't slavishly work through like agile, and we couldn't describe it in any way, right? You could see lots of the things happening, but there was no kind of, we're going to apply this methodology in this context to this thing. And we managed to get something done. I also led part of the team for delivering the COVID certs. And so we built 1 app in 3 days. We built 9 things in 6 weeks. So in 40 days, we built 9 new things. And it was like at a tremendous pace, and you couldn't look at anything from any methodology or framework and say, oh yes, so people would say, are you agile? And we go, yeah, we kind of were, but if you were to look at it in terms of what we did, we probably weren't, right? Because we didn't, not by a definition, by the methodologist or the framework people. So I also think there's another problem here, is that it's this look versus skill thing, right? So and I think it was Jefferson had a quote. I actually looked it up, and it wasn't actually attributed to him. So the harder I work, the luckier I am. So, but there is a look in that. If you look at any of the successful case studies that come out, and I always get freaked out by case studies. So somebody comes out and says, we were successful. They write down all the things that made them successful, and then they attribute that to skill. And in some cases, it's situational and it's luck, right? There's just a situation, there's a context around it. In other cases, like, so if you were to look at any of the failures, so Ken talked about the 70% that failed. If you look at the 70% that failed, I guarantee you they were doing Scrum, they were doing this, they were following all of the same things. So the difference isn't in what we're doing. The difference isn't in the techniques. It's not in any of the stuff around that. I don't think anyway. I think it's useful, but I just think it's it's just something that we can get trapped inside of, right? That we focus on that too much. So, and I think one of the reasons for that is what I'm describing as mimetic profiteering. So, can everybody hear me? Paddy, can you still?
So, no, yeah. we can hear you, Gar. So your slides haven't moved on. I'm not sure if that's intentional
no.
or yeah.
Can you see what? Oh.
We're not in slide share mode either, Gar. We can see your slide design mode or whatever we call that. Yeah, we're with you now.
We're back.
Yeah,
okay,
we're back.
Sorry. I'm going to go back to the beginning. Fast, loose, and disciplined. Steve Kerr. Onto the Golden State Warriors. So this is the, can you see that now? The Davies-McChrystal matrix, buddy?
We can, yeah.
There we go. Right. So this is the crack, no crack, and drama and clear. Now this makes an awful lot more sense, I'm sure, than the last time I talked about it. So we would like everybody to be in the top right-hand corner. I've talked about this. So look versus skill is kind of where we ended up. So mimetic profiteering. If I look at the three things that I've seen most of, it's the cargo cultishness of some of the things that go on in organizations I've been in. So the decoration, we put things on the walls and it looks like we're adhering to something. And we go through the ceremonies. So we do daily stand-ups. So if you look at those daily stand-ups, so all of those people are sitting down and that meeting is going on for 3 hours and not 10 minutes. My favorite one of this was I was in Sweden doing stuff for the company over there, and I said, so they said, so are you agile? Have you tried to implement agile? I said, yes. I said, can you explain, like, what does that mean? And then, well, we do daily stand-ups every Friday between 9 and 12. I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then the other one is structures. So we co-opt these things. So I guess one of the things there is the so if you look at the the Spotify, right? The Spotify organization design structure. So we came up with guilds and chapters. So and squads, which came from somewhere else. So I've added litters and gangs and nuisances. So it's a nuisance of crows, right? Or it's I don't know what it is of crows, but there are other. Sorry, I think it's a nuisance of some kind of monkey of apes. But if you look at these things, we're kind of co-opting and bringing them in, and we follow them and we adhere to them. And even the guys in Spotify laugh at this because they're looking at it after growing it inside their organization, and all the learning was in the design of those things. It's not in the application of something after the fact. It's in actually all of the learning that they got, and the reason why it was successful for them was in actually figuring out what worked inside of their organization, not taking somebody else's idea and just bringing it in. So that's the first one. And then we have, we're at kind of the pinnacle of this now with things like SAFe. So Scaled Agile Framework. So Scaled Agile Framework looks beautiful. The branding is amazing. It says and writes everything. And there's nothing wrong with it when you break into the practices. However, it's just not all there. And all it is just writing down stuff. So aping, so memes and mimicry. So that's another one. So we are, it's one of the human superpowers is that we mimic. So we can create, but we also mimic others. And that's how we share, and that's how ideas propagate. And mimetic, so that idea of memes, so these stories that share and spread, kind of have a viral capacity to them. And we're constantly doing this, so we're constantly aping what other people are doing. But the problem is we end up with this mimetic smuggling, right? Which is anytime you see or hear somebody in your organization say, when I was in the bank, when I was in the insurance company, when I was in the other pharmaceutical company, we did it this way. That's smuggling an idea from somewhere else in. And the problem is, without context to it, it sounds great, but maybe it isn't. So it can become difficult to do. The other one, and this was the one, so we were talking beforehand, and it's the certainty merchants, all right? So the people who know it all. So that might look like some large consulting company's logo, or it might not, but they come out in their quarterly missile and they say, this is the way the world works. You apply this thing and it's going to be great. Here's a framework to do it. Here's a beautiful picture that you can put in a slide deck that everybody robs. And we spread this around the place and it gets worse and worse. So maybe it's the wrong sort of knowing, I think is the first thing. So I kind of came sideways across two different things here. So one is Max Bosso was, he's a knowledge management researcher. He's now passed away out of the UK. And he had this thing called iSpace. And it was looking at the kinds of knowledge that you could have across three dimensions. So so the codification of it, is it abstract or concrete or undiffused and diffused? So I've put three little dots in there to say, so news is highly diffused, right? And it's codified. Common sense isn't codified, right? So but it's diffused, so it goes out around it, but it's not heavily diffused because we know it's not everywhere. And then things like experience. So experience is a concrete thing, but it's localized to an individual, right? So that's one aspect of this. And I think we keep on trying to look at the things that are in that top corner where things are codified, the bottom corner, codified. Sorry, we're trying to do things that are codified and concrete, and then we're trying to diffuse that information. So that's it's trying to do this in 3 dimensions isn't great, but that's what we're trying to do when we codify things into frameworks and methodologies. And then we end up with this other problem of the Dunning-Kruger dilemma, right? Which is people of low competence have high confidence in their ability. So I've got Trump on one side and Buddha on the other side. And this idea of different kinds of knowing. So there's a guy called John Vervaeke, who's a professor in Toronto University, and he has described 4 kinds of knowing. So propositional knowing is knowing about something. Procedural knowing is knowing how to do something. Participatory knowing is that bit where you've embodied it. And then there's a perspectival knowing, which is kind of it doesn't really fit on this, on the Dunning-Kruger thing, but it's looking at it through different perspectives, which I think came up when we were talking about problems. And I think when Rory was talking about it earlier on, that whole idea of looking at problems through different lenses. So I guess one of the dangers here is that people just say, just try harder, right? So why isn't it working? We just try harder. And the problem there is that there is a principle of least action. I'm not going to try and pronounce this guy's surname, but it's Pierre-Louis Moreau de, fill in the gap there, who is a mathematician, philosopher, and man of letters, which I think is a fantastic way. I want man of letters at the end of my name at some point. But the principle of least action is the principle of least action or energy describes how physical processes organized to minimize their consumption of energy. And this directly goes against this idea. And Alan touched on this earlier on in terms of how do we scale this out and what we do it. And Rory talked about it as well in terms of just the scale and kind of pushing this out. One of the challenges with the scale side of it is that if it looks like it's too hard, from an organizational change perspective, it probably is, because everybody else can see this thing and it's an energy gradient. And if that principle holds true, then any time you're trying to change something where the energy gradient of changing it is higher than the energy gradient of staying the same or doing something else, you will fail, right? You will fail because we get stuck in these basins and it's really hard to break out of it. So we've got to recognize that. Other dangers. We spend a huge amount of time, and actually we do it here as well. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, as with every other speaker on it. Take it, hear it, listen, and then go figure it out yourself. Don't rely on us to do your sense making for you, because proxying sense making is the biggest danger. I sat down with Dave Snowden, who's the guy behind the Cynefin framework. And I said, look, Dave, you've done all this reading. I said, I'm trusting that you've done all this reading and that you've made sense of it in a way that makes sense. And he said, yeah. And I said, but that's proxying my sense making to you. So I'm giving it to you. And he said, yeah. I said, what can I do? And he goes, do the reading. And I think that's the lesson out of this, is that we just need to do the reading. We need to actually get in and do it, because otherwise we end up with this acquired helplessness where we're kind of dependent on others. And depending on who you choose to take a dependency on, it gets harder and harder. Simulated thinking is the other one, because I've injected other people's thoughts into my head. And because of the way my brain and memory work, the simulation of thought becomes easy because I remember things. So things like the availability bias crops up. So because it's easy for my brain to access, I think I'm thinking, but I'm really not. I'm just remembering something good. And then mimetic infection. So mimetic infection is where I copy something and copy something and copy something. So imagine you've got the guy who did Scrum for the first time in an organization, takes it into the next organization, trains somebody who takes it into the next organization. You go through 5 organizations and all of the learnings have been distilled down into a bunch of things, and we've lost information. So they're poor copies, right? They're weak sauce. So the other one to remember is that all of this stuff is built on trust. And once we discount the trust side of it, I trust you and we trust in small groups. So Robin Dunbar was, I think he was an anthropologist originally, but he looked at kind of tribal structures and looked at trust with relation to tribal structures. So the 150 number is the one that's most commonly cited, but he actually had 4 numbers. So 5, which is familial groups, 15, which is close friends, 50, and then 150. And the trust begins to degrade over time, 150, and it's to do with the number of relationships that I can manage and keep hold of. So how do we improve the quality of our sense making, choice making, and meaning making is the lesson. I think the problem here is with our thinking, in that the vast majority of the work that's been done in terms of systematizing and coming up with frameworks and methods has been done with a view that we can order or set order to the world, right? You would argue that Agile originally started to try and deal with the complexity type situation, but actually what happened is we ended up trying to slowly defaulting back to this best practice mentality, which pushes it into order and pushes us into an ability to predict the future, which we know is insane. So, and I think from a knowledge management perspective, that brings up this idea that I can think more than I can say, and I can say more than I can write. So as you look at that, the level of information as you pass down through it, it begins to degrade over time. And then I'm writing down only the things I know, but not how I felt about it, right? Not what I'm thinking about it, not what were the various thoughts that I had at a point in time. I end up writing down where we ended up at the end of something, as opposed to that bit in the process. And I think like action research helps with that, because the reflective cycle picks up contextual, contemporaneous information as you go through. So then we're back to iSpace. I seem to have duplicated a slide there. And other forms of knowing. So other forms of knowing, there is a book called Santalk, and it describes kind of tribal or indigenous populations' knowledge systems. And it was written, the author is an Aborigine guy from Australia. And he was describing this, and he described how in some of the tribes, they used the lines on the palm of your hand to encode knowledge about different things. And it makes you think about how we begin to encode knowledge to transmit it. I'm not saying that we do this. I'm not saying that we do knowledge management on the palm of everybody's hand in every organization, but it's just a different framing for it. So I'm going to go back to the Davies-McCreasy matrix. I haven't told Charlie he's in a matrix yet, but he will be. So avoiding drama. I think that's one of the big keys in all of this. So as I reflect back on a lot of the work that we did in the past couple of years, there was a huge amount of drama, but actually what we did was navigate that quite well and try to figure out, it's kind of a drama detection and avoidance system that we were building into the organization. So how do we navigate this and how do we work around it? We also need to get clear and figuring out how do we do it. So this is via processes like inquiry, deliberate disorientation, where I'm actually putting myself in situations where I don't know what the answer is, to create the uncertainty to open up opportunity. And I think this goes back to the problem piece. Rule Omega, which is finding the signal and the noise. So it's kind of how do I have good faith conversations and trust that even though you don't know how to say the thing you want to say, or you might say it in a way that offends me or like really pisses me off, that I can actually see that there's something in what you're saying that's useful. I think the other one has been touched on by a number of people, which is human sensor networks. How do we pick up the stories and the narratives and beliefs in an organization which are holding us there? So I'm going to keep going with this. Who do we need for this? Well, I think we need people who are embracing complexity. They're option makers, they're trade-off takers, and it's opinions over absolutes. So they're willing to hold on to or have an opinion, right, and not believe in something as an absolute right or wrong, and prove it out over time. And people who can tolerate uncertainty. So that's what we're looking for. There's a skills matrix here, which comes from a company or an organization called Lectica, and they were looking at what are the kind of skills and qualities you would need inside of it for basically to have, like, what are the skills associated with people like this? What would we need to teach them? How would they learn these things? And it's things like integrating perspectives, right? Understanding situations, understanding historical contexts, gathering and evaluating information. So there are things that we can do, and they're kind of part of design courses. And I know, Paudie, you've covered it off in some of the kind of curriculum that you cover off in, but I think it's just a different way of looking at this problem. And it's not about teaching people the techniques and the frameworks and the methods, but it's one layer down underneath it. So I'm going to introduce you to Homo Ludens. So Homo Ludens, there was a guy called Johann Huizinga who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, and Ludens is the Latin word for play, right? And I think one of the things that came out of a lot of the work that we did was that there was a playfulness to it. And it was something that we did. So everybody knew, it was like being on a great team, right? A great sports team where everybody knew their job. Everybody knew where the boundary was. Everybody knew what they were good at. Everybody knew where they could add value. And they also knew when to stop. But there was a playfulness to the way we worked, which was kind of interesting in the way it changed the way you thought about problems and gave you a freedom. And I think the reality is that not everybody is there. So some people are clear and some people are crack and some people are no crack and drama. Right? So we want to avoid the bottom left-hand corner, but we have to deal with the other two. And Homo Ludens is just this person, right? Having the crack, but disciplined. So this is the fast, loose, and disciplined. These are the kind of people that we need to work in this environment. So if I take the humor and playfulness aspect, and I'm jumping around here. So how do we cut or manage the bed capacity crisis in healthcare? We double up, right? It's a terrible idea. I'm not suggesting the HSE have even considered it. but a question came up or something came up in the context of a conversation we were having about how would you solve some of these bigger, hairy, thorny problems? And this doesn't answer the question, and it would never happen. But at the same time, it makes you think about it in a different way. And the levity of the humor allows you to think differently about it. The other one that came up quite recently was trying to come up with the idea, well, it was different ideas for health apps. So Hinder and Twinge are Tinder and Hinge, which are two dating related apps, but it's Tinder for health. So what would it look like? And the guards have actually done this. There was a hackathon, policing hackathon in Sweden, and they were doing Tinder for policing. So it was like swipe left or swipe right if it's a criminal or not a criminal. But that idea of taking metaphors and analogies from different places and playing with it in a fun and lighthearted way. There's something different about the way you work when that happens. There's something different about the vibe on the team, and it is a vibe. It's something that people pick up off each other. So I know there's a couple of musicians on the panel as well, and musicians playing with each other pick up a vibe from each other, and they're kind of working that way. I'm not a musician. There's a guitar in the background, and the reason I've got the flag up is because you can't see it and make any assumption. So then how do we work and working at scale? Well, so 4 aspects to this. So conspiring, breathing together, having conversations. This is all about having better quality conversations, playing together. And so Rory talked about the Lego Serious Play, and I am a Lego Serious Play practitioner, right? That's one of the things I picked up along the way. That's a really interesting thing. Seeking solutions together. So trying to understand problems, trying to find solutions, and corrupting. And the root of corrupting means breaking all together, right? And corruption, all of these things in some way have bad connotations, but they're actually really interesting. And I think in the context of solving the bigger problems we've got, that's the direction we need to be going. And it's either sync or sync. So synchronization is going to be key. So some final thoughts, and I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. So my son is I'm going to say reasonably good athlete. And we were concerned about strain. So we got him a Whoop band. And the Whoop band is something you wear 24/7, and it looks at 2 different metrics. And again, this goes back to what Mark was talking about, ways to measure things. Strain and recovery. So strain on one side is how much effort have we exerted, and on the other side, how much did we spend to recover? So these are actually taken from he was playing a final yesterday, and it was like strain of 15.6 out of 21. I'll have to give out to him about that. It wasn't enough. And then just go through that process of strain and recovery. But those 2 things as an idea with relation to digital transformation and organizations, there's something in that I think is interesting and related to what we were talking about before. And the other one has come up as well. Sorry, I blanked on the name, Sharon. Sharon talked about fear. So this thing about fear is the other one that's a debilitating thing that happens. It's a debilitating piece. So any Dune fans out there, it's the litany against fear. So I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer, right? It is the thing that stops us and prevents us from making progress. So I think with that, I am done. Paddy?
Good man, Gareth. And there's absolutely a treasure trove of ideas, concepts in there. The one thing that interests me, Gar, and we're fairly much up on time, but I know I've maybe also said it about the Knafen model that you referred to with Dave Snowden, is that, any system has structured and ordered elements, but it also has complex elements. So if someone says it's structured, they can point at things that are structured within it. But if someone wants to find complexity, they will find complexity in it. And in a way, the way you see it nearly depends on the mindset you bring into it. I also, in a way, therefore, the assumption is, and very often with designers, we encourage them to nearly have a mindset that assumes there's complexity there, so they see the sort of nuances, etc. But at the same time, we all can't do that. We do also need people, that don't keep on going back to first principles, that will work off models and get stuff done now. It may not be optimum, but they'll get stuff done. Where just sort of a 1-minute answer, Gar, where do you live in terms of that whole issue?
So I guess, but the problem there is, Paddy, that I love the messiness, right? So that's where I'm most comfortable. So it's difficult for me to answer that question. I see the need for all of those things. And part of the Knafen model, the bit that's interesting is that all of those things are true, and that the recipes that work in the ordered domain, right? So the best practice stuff, and Rory talked about ITIL earlier on. The stuff that works well. when it's well understood and I can point to it. But it's where we try and apply things that were designed for an ordered domain in a complex environment. That's where it falls apart. And I think that's the difficulty. And part of that, like Kevin has described as a sense-making framework, and part of it is making sense of where I am. So there's 5 domains in the model, and it starts out with aporia or confusion. So in the middle of the model, which is the bit that gets forgotten about, it usually gets kind of stylized as having 4 quadrants, but actually there's a 5th in the middle, which says, I don't know where I am. So it's that idea of being disoriented, of not knowing where I am. And then I've got to make sense of where I am based on the constraints in that environment. And then I figure out where I can go from there. And I think that's one of the challenges here, is that it's too easy for us to go to default into just using a framework or using a methodology because it's there or because somebody else did it. And because the kind of the way we're wired is to look at what other people have done. And I'm going to say, like, if you look at Gartner, if you look at McKinsey, if you look at anybody like that, that's all based on observations in other companies that I'm taking into my company and saying, I'm going to bring that in and it's going to be magic. Look, it's going to be amazing. And when it doesn't work, we blame someone. And when it does work, we reward people for it. But most of the time, we're reading the same stuff, we're doing the same things, but we're not challenging the ideas or understanding the context. And that's where I am on that. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
No, I think actually it's worthy of a whole nearly event around it, Gard, and maybe that's something we should do going forward. I think I know people that live in what I would call a very complex world, but they live in a very structured, ordered way, and they survive and they're quite comfortable. But I also know people that are nearly the opposite. But I think that's maybe for another day, guys. It's been an absolute I suppose privilege to be here today. I'm just even looking back over the notes. I've no idea how Alan is going to make sense of some really interesting presentations. A lot of consistencies there, but also some differences, I think. So I'm going to just hand over maybe to Alan. A bit unfair on poor Alan, but I'm still going to. He's probably used to me throwing curved balls at him at this stage, So I'm going to do it again, Alan.
That's all right. It's part of the mix, really, and it's been really fascinating to hear so many great stories, illustrations, and interesting also, by the way, that everybody has represented their viewpoints in some form of ordered way, right? We've all taken an expression of ideas and said, these are the things that we were doing. Here's the approach that we took. Gar, yourself, kind of almost reveling in the chaos, but actually coming out of that chaos, you've been able to identify patterns, and that they may not necessarily be ordered repeatability, but there is a form of recognizable characteristic going on there. And you're associating with folks who actually probably also are comfortable in those kinds of environments and working in those ways where there's a language that you all share, a behavioral language that can then translate into that's how we do things around here. It's not necessarily written down in a process and so on, but there's definitely an agreement as to how are we going to approach things, or you come to that agreement through working it out together. I think the other thing that's been absolutely illustrative throughout from everybody is this sense of fun, crack. I mean, I can't say it properly because I don't have the the cultural I wouldn't do the cultural appropriation to do so, but that sense of enjoyment, joy, I think, word you used again, that we're all in our different ways passionate people, and that comes through hugely in everything that we've said. And if we can encourage and foster that, can't say replicate it, but encourage and foster it, then that is worth a huge amount. Just delightful, inspiring, thought-provoking. And I think the one word I'm going to leave everybody with, and I've kind of said it a couple of times in the chat, is about the willingness and the embracing of learning that the more we pay attention to what's going on around us, understand it, and take something out of it, the better off we all are. And in that learning individually, then also teaching that with others, and encouraging learning in other people as well. And I think that's the essence of modern data and analytics leadership, is not only a willingness to learn, but the encouragement in others to do so too.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really nice points there. And actually, my list wasn't too much different, Alan. Definitely this idea of the fun of exploring, the fun of just going in there and trying to figure things out. Patterns, even if the pattern is an anti-pattern, we don't do it that way. In a way, that is itself is a pattern, that we challenge the status quo. And look, I think when we talk about practitioner research here, it's definitely about, challenging the status quo. It's about even a subversive element, saying, look, we're not going to accept the rules that others apply just for the sake of it, that we want to challenge them.
Yeah.
And I love that. And we heard it in a good few of the presentations. I also heard maybe that sort of sometimes the conflict, I think was it Sharon in particular, saying people wanted the rules of the team engagement, but the very idea was not to give them the rules so that they would learn through the process of being in the mess. So I think that's really, really fascinating. And I suppose just as a group here, I know a lot of us have been involved in sort of research seminars in Cork University Business School. That's probably something we're going to now post-COVID try and get going again. I think the dynamic was very different when it was a face-to-face versus an online, and it was a good bit of fun maybe that sometimes you have in a face-to-face that sometimes doesn't always translate to an online environment. And again, if people watching this, and I know we've had good numbers during the morning, I can also see actually numbers on LinkedIn and YouTube during the morning as well. But if people are interested in that, then please let us know, and we'll be trying to recreate and refine some of that fun pre-COVID fun. And look, we've a lot of complexity that came about during COVID, etc. To, I suppose, to have a bit of fun with, even though there were also very, very harrowing times for many. So guys, I'm really conscious of time as well. I think we've done really well, because I knew we had some real good talkers on the panel today, and we've done incredibly well to get where we've got by, what is it, just 20 to 1 now. So I'd like to just say a special thanks, first of all, to Alan. So Alan always, you throw a gauntlet down at Alan, he never throws it back really at you. He takes it up. So I really appreciate him being here to do the keynote, but also to summarize. And I know it's going to also be a trigger to some further conversations with Alan going forward. I'd really like to thank our panel, from Mark, who started us off, Ken, Rory, Sharon, Gar, and I think I'm definitely known that I know it's going to take me a day or two to process a lot of the ideas that have been presented today and find some of those connections. Also, I'd just like to say thanks to the audience for being here, for asking the questions. There was lots of questions we didn't get at. There's lots of also comments there that I know will be helpful to the guys, when they're reflecting back on their own presentations and the research they're doing. And just finally, I'd like to say a special thanks to the committee of the Digital Transformation Lab, and also to the support of Cork University Business School. And this, I suppose, as I said earlier, is the kickstart now that we go back to maybe those research seminars, those face-to-face sessions that we've had the benefit of, particularly pre-COVID. We've been online since COVID kicked off. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to say a final few words, guys, here.
Yeah, I'd say, just from my perspective, Paddy, getting those seminars back would be tremendous, and they were hugely, hugely valuable. Thank you to you, Paddy, who puts a great deal of work into these. I met Rory today for the first time, and Alan. I know Gar and Ken and Sharon, of course. But thank you, and thank you to Cork University Business School and UCC as well. Tremendous, and thank you for everything you've done, Paul.
Yeah, and let's keep on challenging the status quo, guys. There's a lot in the world that still needs to be challenged. So I suppose that's flying the flag, that practitioner research agenda. So at this point, guys, we'll say Gora Mil Good to each and every one of us that were here today, whether in the audience or on the panel or the keynote, Alan. And we'll hopefully be seeing you all again shortly. Take care, guys.
Thanks, buddy. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you, Sharon.
Have a great week, guys. Bye-bye.